Cryptomnesia is a haunting psychological phenomenon where your mind betrays you, allowing a forgotten memory to resurface, not as a memory, but as something original. You believe you've had a groundbreaking idea, a flash of brilliance, a moment of genius, only to discover it's something you heard, saw, or read before. And in that eerie betrayal, your brain disguises theft as creation. Cryptomnesia. This phenomenon strikes with a quiet cruelty. It doesn't come with alarms or warnings. Instead, it whispers to you, making you believe that what you've just said, written, or thought is yours alone. It feels like insight. It feels like genius. But it's a ghost from the past, something you unconsciously absorbed and buried long ago, now returning in disguise. It could be a melody, a line of poetry, a business idea, or even a scientific theory. You claim it because it feels like it came from within, and that's the trap. Cryptomnesia occurs when the brain fails to tag a memory with its original source. The content remains, but the context is lost. It often hits creators, writers, inventors, people who consume and create constantly, walking a fine line between inspiration and imitation. They don't mean to copy. They don't mean to steal. But intention doesn't matter when you're standing in front of an audience, proudly unveiling what you believe is yours, only to realize someone else got there first, sometimes long ago. This bias ruins reputations. It starts lawsuits. It destroys trust. Yet it's rarely malicious. That's what makes it so terrifying. You could be guilty of plagiarism without ever knowing. Your brilliance could be someone else's echo. And once that illusion cracks, it doesn't just cast doubt on one idea. It makes you question how many other original thoughts were merely forgotten shadows of something you once absorbed. People who fall victim to cryptomnesia often feel shame, confusion, even horror, because in that moment, they don't just feel like frauds, they feel possessed, as if their mind, their creativity, their identity was hijacked by a stranger they used to be, a version of themselves that once consumed the very thing they now claim to have invented. And the scariest part? You won't see it coming, because cryptomnesia doesn't knock. It slides in, wears your voice, and convinces you the words were always yours. Moral Credential Effect. The Moral Credential Effect is a dangerous illusion of virtue, a psychological trap that convinces you that your past goodness gives you a free pass to act poorly in the future. It's the quiet whisper that says, you've earned this, you've been generous, you've been kind, you've done the right thing, so now, indulging in a little selfishness, telling a white lie, making a questionable choice, it's fine, you've built credit, and now you're cashing it in. This bias is not just about morality, it's about how morality becomes currency. Like a psychological bank account, you store away good deeds and later withdraw permission to behave badly. A person who donates to charity might feel less guilty about insulting someone later. A manager who prides themselves on hiring diversely might unconsciously discriminate, believing they can't be biased. A partner who's been emotionally supportive might feel entitled to lash out just this once. After all, they've been so good for so long. What makes the moral credential effect so dangerous is that it doesn't feel like rationalization. It feels like fairness. You've been good, so now you get to be human. But it's not fairness. It's self-deception, and it slips under the radar because it disguises immorality as deserved freedom. The better a person sees themselves, the more permission they grant to their own shadows, and they rarely realize it's happening. This bias fuels hypocrisy. Leaders preach integrity, then act unethically in private, feeling justified by their service. Activists who fight for justice may excuse cruelty in debate, believing the righteousness of their cause absolves their behavior. It explains how people can be both saints and sinners, not in contradiction, but in sequence, because the first part of their story gives moral cover to the second. It also makes us blind to our own double standards. We criticize others for actions we excuse in ourselves just because we believe we've earned the right to slip. We weaponize our goodness not against others, but against our own accountability. And that's the heartbreak. The more virtuous we think we are, the more likely we are to fall into moral blindness, because the moral credential effect doesn't destroy ethics from the outside. It corrupts them from within. Ben Franklin Effect. The Ben Franklin Effect is a deeply counterintuitive twist in human psychology. It reveals that we don't just do favors for people we like. We start liking people because we do them favors. It's as if our minds can't handle the discomfort of being generous to someone we feel neutral or even negative toward. So instead, we rewrite the story. I must like them, the mind concludes. Otherwise, why would I have helped them? The origin of this effect lies in a real strategy used by Benjamin Franklin himself. Faced with a political rival who disliked him, Franklin didn't argue, flatter, or confront. He simply asked the man to lend him a rare book. The man obliged, and something shifted. Soon after, their cold relationship warmed into friendship. Why? Because once the rival had helped Franklin, his brain sought consistency. It couldn't reconcile doing a favor for someone he disliked, so it changed the narrative. I must respect him. And that subtle rewrite, triggered not by charm or persuasion, but by a favor, changed everything. At its core, the Ben Franklin effect exposes how fragile and fluid our emotions really are. We imagine them to be fixed, linear, grounded in reason, but often our feelings follow our actions, not the other way around. We build affection through effort. We create closeness through investment, and the very act of helping becomes the seed of connection. This phenomenon explains why people feel more bonded to pets, children, or projects they care for, even when those things don't return the favor. It's also why manipulators exploit it. They ask for favors, knowing full well that the act of giving pulls people closer. It's why cults assign chores, why con artists ask for small, harmless help, why toxic relationships survive, because one person keeps giving, and in doing so, deepens their emotional tether. It's a paradox. We think giving is the result of love, but often it's the cause, and the more we give, the more we feel compelled to justify it with attachment, even to people who might not deserve it. The Ben Franklin effect doesn't just reveal how influence works, it reveals how easily we can be rewired by our own kindness. Empathy gap. The empathy gap is a chilling flaw in human perception, our deep inability to grasp just how profoundly emotions shape thoughts, decisions, and behaviors, both in others and within ourselves. It's not just a lack of empathy, it's a blind spot, a cruel distance between logic and feeling that makes us believe we are rational, when in truth, we are drowning in emotions we refuse to acknowledge. When you're calm, it's almost impossible to imagine how you'll think or act in a state of rage, panic, lust, fear, or despair. And when you're consumed by those feelings, reason disappears like a whisper in a storm. This is the empathy gap. It makes you underestimate how powerful emotions can be until you're in their grip. Only then do you realize how little control you actually had, but by then, the damage is often already done. It makes us judge others harshly because we forget what it's like to be in their emotional state. A person who is heartbroken looks irrational to someone who is not. A person in withdrawal seems weak to someone who's never been addicted. A mother in grief, a man in rage, a child in terror, all seem over the top if we observe them from a distance of calm. Because we can't feel what they feel, we underestimate what those feelings do to the mind. And so we label instead of understand. This bias is why people make promises they can't keep. It's why they say, I'll never drink again, I'll never go back to them, or next time I'll stay calm, not realizing they're making these vows from a cold state that cannot comprehend the heat of future emotions. And when the storm returns, so do the same mistakes, over and over again. The empathy gap also fuels cruelty. When someone is begging, sobbing, or breaking down, it's easy to dismiss them if you're emotionally detached. You don't feel the desperation. You don't understand the panic. So you assume they're exaggerating. Or worse, you believe they're weak. Because the empathy gap doesn't just make us blind to others, it makes us unrecognizable to ourselves in emotional states we pretend don't exist, until they do, and they devour us. Licensing effect. The licensing effect is one of the most deceptive tricks the mind plays on itself, a quiet internal permission slip that turns past virtue into a weapon against your own integrity. It whispers, "You've done enough good, now you can afford to slip." And so, with almost no resistance, you do. This effect takes root in the illusion of moral balance. After donating to charity, you feel entitled to indulge. After working out, you justify unhealthy eating. After being kind all day, you snap at someone and excuse it as a well-earned release. The danger isn't in the act itself, it's in the invisible transaction happening beneath the surface. You're not acting from impulse, you're acting from perceived entitlement. Your own goodness becomes the reason you allow yourself to be bad. It doesn't stop at personal habits. It seeps into relationships, workplaces, power structures. A boss who prides themselves on fairness might belittle an employee behind closed doors, feeling morally insulated by their overall good leadership. A partner who's attentive and romantic might justify emotional manipulation later, convinced they've built up enough credit to get away with it. The licensing effect doesn't need you to be a villain, it just needs you to feel like a hero first. This bias isn't about malice, it's about exhaustion. Moral effort is draining. Every act of self-control, empathy, or generosity uses mental energy, and once we've spent that energy, we look for ways to refill ourselves. But instead of rest or reflection, we often choose moral shortcuts. We don't break rules in spite of our values. We break them because we believe we've proven those values already. And that's the trap. The better you think you are, the more you'll unconsciously excuse your lapses. The mind clings to its self-image, and when your actions threaten that image, it doesn't correct the behavior. It rewrites the rules. It says, "You've earned this. This isn't really wrong. Others do worse." The licensing effect turns character into currency. And once we start spending our goodness like it's credit, we begin to rot from the inside out. Not all at once, but choice by choice, blind to the erosion until the damage is done. Decoy effect. The decoy effect is a sinister trick of perception, an invisible hand guiding your choices without your awareness, reshaping what you want by altering the way options are presented. It doesn't change the value of things, it changes how you see them. And once you fall for it, you'll swear your decision was rational, when in truth, it was manipulated from the start. Imagine being offered two choices, a small coffee for $3 or a large for $5. It's a tough call, but now imagine a third option appears, a medium coffee for $4.50. Suddenly, the large seems like a bargain, the small seems too little, and the medium, it becomes a sacrificial lamb, designed to exist, not to be chosen, but to make you choose differently. This is the decoy effect. The introduction of a clearly inferior third option tilts your judgment, pushing you toward the choice the designer wants you to make, while making you feel like you arrived there on your own. What's terrifying is how easily it works. Your brain isn't evaluating each choice in isolation, it's comparing. And when a new option enters the scene, it warps the context. The decoy doesn't need to be attractive, it just needs to be close enough to one choice, and worse than it in every way. That's all it takes for the stronger option to suddenly feel like the obvious one. You feel smart, efficient, in control, but the truth is, your preference just got rewritten. This technique is everywhere, in marketing, politics, job offers, subscription models, even relationships. You're presented with a deliberately weak competitor to make the target option shine. That overpriced deluxe package, it's there to make the premium one feel reasonable. That obviously unqualified candidate in a political race, they might exist just to make someone else look better by contrast. You're not evaluating the world as it is. You're evaluating what seems better in a twisted comparison designed by someone else. The most chilling part? The decoy effect hijacks your sense of agency. You don't feel forced or deceived. You feel empowered, like you made a wise, informed decision. But it wasn't your logic that won. It was a trick of perception, a trap built into the architecture of choice. Illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency is a cruel distortion of self-awareness, the belief that your thoughts, feelings, and inner turmoil are visible to others when, in truth, they are not. You think your voice sounds shaky, your guilt is obvious, your fear is written all over your face. You believe people can see right through you, but they can't. And that disconnect creates a dangerous loop of anxiety, shame, and miscommunication. This bias stems from a simple truth. You live inside your own head. You feel everything with raw intensity. Your nervousness before a presentation, your embarrassment after a mistake, your rage behind a calm expression. Because these emotions are so loud inside you, you assume they must be obvious on the outside. You think others can feel what you're feeling, but they can't. They're guessing, distracted, consumed with their own internal noise, and most of the time, they don't notice at all. The illusion of transparency feeds social anxiety like gasoline on fire. It convinces you that every awkward silence, every flushed cheek, every stumbled word is being judged, that your internal chaos is visible, and that everyone is quietly evaluating your failure to hold it together. But here's the truth that rarely comes easy. People aren't watching you as closely as you think. Most of them are too busy worrying about how they're being seen. This bias is also deeply manipulative in emotional conflict. When you're hurt but silent, you expect others to notice. When you're angry but composed, you think your fury radiates. But when no one reacts, you feel invisible because you believe your emotions were obvious and ignored. Resentment builds, relationships crack, not because people are heartless, but because they simply didn't see what you assumed you were showing. The illusion of transparency leaves people feeling misunderstood, rejected, isolated, when in reality, they were never truly exposed to begin with. It traps you in a false spotlight where your shame feels public, your insecurity feels broadcasted, and your silence feels deafening. But the real heartbreak is this: the world isn't ignoring your pain. It's just not aware of it. Because in a mind ruled by this illusion, vulnerability feels like a scream. But outside, it barely makes a sound. Self-other knowledge, asymmetry, SOCA. Self-other knowledge asymmetry, or SOCA, is one of the most quietly devastating psychological biases, a fracture in self-perception that convinces us we are experts on who we are, even in the very areas where others often see us more clearly. It's the illusion that we understand ourselves better than anyone else possibly could. But the truth is far more unsettling. Sometimes they know us better than we do. This bias thrives in the shadows of the ego. It whispers that your thoughts, your intentions, your private world are sacred truths, visible only to you. You live with your inner monologue. You feel your doubts, your reasons, your excuses. So when someone critiques your behavior, saying you're arrogant, insecure, passive-aggressive, you reject it. They don't understand me. They don't know what I meant. But what if they don't need to know your intent? What if they see your patterns more clearly than you ever could? Research shows that while we do have intimate access to our emotions and thoughts, others often have more accurate insight into our observable traits, like intelligence, anxiety, or social awkwardness. We're too close to see ourselves clearly. Our insecurities cloud objectivity. Our need to protect our identity edits the truth. We mistake internal awareness for external accuracy, and that's where Soka takes root. It damages relationships because we assume we're transparent. We believe we're being kind, honest, reasonable, but others see the tension in our jaw, hear the bite in our tone, notice the distance in our eyes, and when they point it out, we bristle, we defend, because this bias tells us they're wrong, they're misinterpreting us, but often they're not. They're simply seeing the parts we refuse to confront. Soka is why feedback feels like an attack, why we flinch when someone holds up a mirror that doesn't match the image we've curated, why we downplay our flaws and overestimate our strengths. It protects our ego, but it also traps us, because as long as we believe we're the sole authority on who we are, we stop listening. And when we stop listening, we stop growing. The most painful truths about ourselves often don't come from within. They come from the people who have the courage to tell us what we won't admit. Cheerleader Effect. The cheerleader effect is a quiet illusion, a trick of perception that reveals just how easily beauty can be distorted by context. It happens when someone appears more attractive simply because they are seen as part of a group, not because they changed, but because your brain did. This effect plays out silently in everyday life. A person standing alone might barely catch your eye, but place them in a group, laughing, moving, blending into the energy of others, and suddenly they shine. You can't explain why. Their face looks a little more symmetrical, their smile more inviting, their presence more magnetic. You feel drawn in, but not to them exactly, to the version of them shaped by the collective. Your brain smooths the rough edges. It averages out flaws. It enhances social proof, creating beauty from belonging. This illusion doesn't arise from malice. It's how our brains evolved. We're wired to trust groups. In prehistoric times, survival depended on reading social signals quickly. Who is liked, who is respected, who fits in. So when we see someone surrounded by others, especially attractive or confident others, we unconsciously assign them the same qualities. They must be desirable. They must be safe. They must be valuable. Otherwise, why would they be part of the group? The cheerleader effect fuels everything from advertising to dating apps to high school popularity contests. It's why brands use group shots in commercials. It's why cliques seem more appealing from the outside. It's why influencers post with squads. It's not just about beauty. It's about perception, status, belonging. Your brain isn't evaluating one face. It's calculating the context around the face. This effect also explains the crashing disappointment that sometimes follows the illusion. When someone seen in a vibrant group is later encountered alone, they can seem strangely diminished, not ugly, just less. The energy is gone, the social glow has faded, and you're left wondering if the attraction was ever real, or just something your mind made up in the noise of the crowd. That's the darkness of the cheerleader effect. It shows how fragile and manipulated our standards of beauty can be, how quickly we confuse connection with charisma, how even attraction, something we believe to be intimate and instinctual, can be just another illusion built from the people standing nearby. Hot-cold empathy gap. The hot-cold empathy gap is a cruel twist in human awareness, our complete inability to understand how drastically our thoughts, choices, and morals shift depending on our emotional state. When we're calm, we can't imagine the things we'll do when we're overwhelmed. And when we're in the grip of desire, fear, anger, or pain, the calm version of ourselves feels like a stranger, distant, naive, irrelevant. You can sit in a quiet room and swear you'll never lose your temper. You can promise yourself you won't give in to that addiction again. You can map out how you'll act in a crisis, rational, composed, moral, but all of that crumbles when the emotional storm hits. You scream, you relapse, you betray your own ethics, and afterward, you ask yourself, why did I do that? That's not who I am. But it is who you are when you're in a different state, and the version of you that made all those calm promises, that version never stood a chance. This is the hot-cold empathy gap, the chasm between who we are in emotional neutrality and who we become in emotional extremes. It distorts foresight. It sabotages self-control. It convinces us that we can resist temptation, endure pain, or remain virtuous because we're making those predictions in a state where the stakes are imaginary. We're planning for hunger while full. We're preparing for panic while at peace. And so, when reality arrives, we fail. This bias doesn't just affect how we see ourselves, it poisons how we judge others. We see someone crumble under pressure and call them weak. We watch someone beg for relief and label them dramatic. We forget that emotions hijack the brain, cloud judgment, and twist reality. And because we can't feel what they feel in that moment, we can't understand what they're capable of or incapable of. The hot-cold empathy gap is why addicts relapse, why couples fight despite their love, why people betray promises they made to themselves. It's why we prepare poorly for stress and why apologies come laced with disbelief. I don't know what came over me. What came over you was the version of yourself you forgot existed, and it had more power than you were willing to admit. Dunning-Kruger Effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cruel paradox of human self-awareness, where the people who know the least are often the most convinced that they know the most. It is the dangerous illusion that ignorance wears as confidence, a psychological blindfold that turns inexperience into arrogance and error into certainty. At its core, this bias is born from a simple tragedy. To recognize the limits of your knowledge, you have to possess enough knowledge to see those limits. But when someone is deeply incompetent in a skill or subject, they lack not only the ability to perform, they lack the ability to realize they are performing poorly. Their failures feel like success. Their misunderstanding feels like mastery. And so, with unchecked certainty, they speak louder, act bolder, and spread misinformation with the conviction of an expert. It shows up everywhere. Online debates, boardrooms, classrooms, politics. The loudest voice is often not the wisest, but the least aware of their own ignorance. Meanwhile, those with true understanding speak more cautiously, question themselves, hedge their words, because expertise comes with the painful awareness of complexity, of doubt, of how much there is still to learn. And that's the cruelest part. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't just elevate the incompetent, it silences the competent. It creates a warped world where the wrong people lead, while the right ones second-guess themselves into quiet corners. It rewards false confidence and punishes humility. It turns knowledge into a burden and ignorance into a weapon. This bias is why charlatans rise to power, why conspiracy theorists shout down scientists, why novices criticize experts without understanding the weight of what they're challenging. It's not just annoying, it's dangerous, because when unearned confidence drives decisions, the consequences fall on everyone. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: no one is immune. We all start as beginners, and in that early stage, before failure teaches us humility, we are all vulnerable to believing we're better than we are. That's what makes this bias so persistent, so universal. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't come with a warning sign. It arrives disguised as competence, and if you're not careful, you'll mistake your first taste of knowledge for wisdom, never realizing just how deep the well really goes. Reverse Dunning-Kruger effect. The reverse Dunning-Kruger effect is a quiet, often painful bias experienced by the truly competent, those who have mastered a skill, honed a craft, or deeply understood a subject. It is the false belief that what you know is obvious, that others must surely see what you see, think as clearly, or understand as deeply. And in this assumption lies a tragic miscalculation. You overestimate the knowledge of others, and in doing so, you underestimate the value of your own. People with genuine competence often don't see their abilities as extraordinary. The effort, the years of learning, the intuition they've built, it all becomes second nature. It feels easy, and because it feels easy, They assume it must be easy for everyone else. They don't see their genius as genius. They see it as normal, so they hold back. They stay quiet. They question whether they're qualified to speak up. After all, everyone probably already knows this, right? But they don't. That's the painful truth. The reverse Dunning-Kruger effect makes you doubt your worth in rooms you belong in. It silences you during meetings. It makes you second-guess your insight, delay your ambitions, and hand your power to louder, less capable voices. While the truly incompetent often speak with confidence, the truly competent often speak with hesitation. They couch brilliance in disclaimers. They shrink in the face of overconfidence, not because they're unsure of the answer, but because they mistakenly assume everyone else knows it too. This bias damages more than self-esteem. It warps how knowledge is shared. Teachers assume students understand the basics. Leaders skip steps. Experts fail to communicate, not out of arrogance, but out of misplaced humility. The world suffers in silence, while loud ignorance steals the stage. And the cruelty of it all is this: the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. But what you forget is how far you've come. You forget how rare your understanding truly is. You forget that clarity and ease are earned through struggle, and that what feels simple to you might be a revelation to someone else. The reverse Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't just distort how you see others. It quietly erases how you see yourself. Mere ownership effect. The mere ownership effect is a quiet distortion in how we value the world, a subtle psychological twist that makes us overestimate the worth of something simply because it belongs to us. It doesn't matter how ordinary, flawed, or forgettable the object might be. Once it crosses the invisible line between theirs and mine, it transforms. It becomes special, desirable, defended. This bias is so deeply embedded in the human psyche that we rarely notice it. A coffee mug, a worn-out hoodie, a car you've owned for years. These things might hold little objective value, but once they are yours, they gain emotional weight. You argue they're better, more meaningful, more you. Even if a stranger's identical mug sits right beside yours, you'll find ways to believe yours is superior. Why? Because your mind isn't valuing the object. It's protecting the identity wrapped around it. This effect isn't just about objects. It bleeds into opinions, ideas, even relationships. Once we adopt a belief, we guard it as our own. We become irrationally attached to our political views, our traditions, our chosen side in any debate, not because they're always right, but because they're ours. We inflate their value to protect our sense of self. The mere ownership effect is exploited constantly by marketers, salespeople, influencers. Free samples, trial periods, just try it on offers, all designed to create the illusion of ownership. Because once you touch it, hold it, imagine it in your life, your brain begins to anchor value to it, and letting go starts to hurt. You don't just lose an object, you lose something tied to your identity. But this bias also reveals something darker about human attachment. We justify keeping things we don't need. We cling to toxic relationships because they feel familiar. We defend old decisions long after they've stopped serving us, not because they make sense, but because they are ours. And the idea of losing what we own, even emotionally, feels like losing a piece of ourselves. The mere ownership effect doesn't just inflate value, it distorts truth. It blurs the line between possession and pride, objectivity and obsession. And without realizing it, we end up trapped in a world where the things we hold on to say more about our need to belong than their actual worth. Toxic positivity bias. Toxic positivity bias is the suffocating pressure to be relentlessly upbeat, even when everything inside you is breaking. It's the lie that says, if you just think positive, everything will be fine, that your pain is weakness, that your grief is ungrateful, that your anger is inconvenient. It's the force-fed smile when you want to scream, the empty, it'll all work out when what you need is to cry, to rage, to feel like a human being, not a motivational quote. This bias overvalues positive thinking to the point of erasure. It silences real emotion under the weight of forced optimism. It shows up when someone tells you to just stay strong after loss, when your anxiety is met with just breathe, when your depression is dismissed with others have it worse. It masquerades as support, but what it really does is deny your reality. Toxic positivity comes from a deep discomfort with negative emotion. People don't want to sit in your darkness because they can't face their own. So, they cover it. They try to fix it. They skip straight to the silver lining, not realizing they're cutting out your heart in the process. And when you internalize that bias, you begin to gaslight yourself. You tell yourself to smile, to stop overreacting, to bury the rage, numb the sadness, ignore the ache, because feeling bad about life somehow means you're doing life wrong. But that's the lie. The truth is that pain is not failure. Grief is not weakness. Sadness is not ungratefulness. Your darkest emotions are not problems to solve. They are truths to honor. And yet toxic positivity turns healing into performance. It demands you shine when you're bleeding. It insists you be grateful for the trauma that nearly destroyed you. It praises your resilience while ignoring the cost of it. This bias doesn't just damage mental health, it isolates people. It creates shame around real emotion. It tells the suffering that they are alone because no one else is talking about how much it hurts. And so they retreat, they pretend, they fake hope until the weight of unspoken pain becomes unbearable. Toxic positivity doesn't heal, it hides. And what we hide, we carry forever. Not invented here bias. The not invented here bias is a quiet arrogance masquerading as loyalty to one's own tribe, team, or mind. It is the instinct to reject ideas, solutions, or innovations, not because they are flawed, but simply because they weren't born within your walls. If it didn't come from your brain, your group, your company, your culture, it's suspect, dismissed, unwelcome. This bias doesn't announce itself with hostility. It creeps in with pride. It tells you that your way is better, your approach more refined, your standards higher. It's the reason organizations sabotage themselves by ignoring brilliant external ideas. It's why teams reinvent the wheel, wasting months building something that already exists, just to avoid admitting someone else got there first. On a personal level, it shows up when someone offers advice you didn't ask for, when a competitor shares something useful, when an outsider criticizes your system with truth. The reaction is not logic, it's ego. A quiet voice inside says, "They don't understand, they're not one of us. If it mattered, we would have thought of it." But the not invented here bias isn't just inefficient, it's dangerous. It fosters isolation. It kills collaboration. It convinces groups to overvalue their own intelligence and ignore the genius standing just outside the door. In medicine, it delays life-saving techniques. In business, it crushes innovation. In relationships, it creates walls between people who might otherwise grow from each other's perspective. The most devastating aspect is how good it feels. There's a comfort in believing you don't need help, that your circle is complete, that outsiders have nothing to offer. It reinforces identity, control, superiority, but it also breeds stagnation, because when you close the door on outside influence, you don't just shut out threats, you shut out progress. And beneath it all is fear. Fear that someone else might be smarter, that a better idea might come from across the aisle, that you're not the sole architect of every solution. The not invented here bias doesn't protect your standards, it protects your ego, and in doing so, it builds a fortress around your mind, brick by brick, idea by idea, until all that remains are echoes of what could have been if you just let something foreign in. Identifiable victim effect. The identifiable victim effect is one of the most heartbreaking flaws in human compassion. It's the reason a single child's tear-streaked face can move nations to act, while the silent deaths of thousands are met with a shrug. We are wired to feel deeply for one, but go numb when suffering becomes a number. The more people who suffer, the less we seem to care. It's not that we're cruel, it's that we're human. Our empathy was built for tribes, not data. Our ancestors didn't face global crises or abstract statistics. They faced the suffering of those in front of them. When you hear about one person trapped in a well, your heart twists. You imagine their fear. You see their eyes. But when you're told 10,000 people are dying of hunger in a faraway land, your brain short-circuits. The tragedy becomes faceless. The emotion fades, and action disappears. This is the core of the identifiable victim effect. We are moved by individuals we can picture, not by anonymous masses. Give the victim a name, a story, a photograph, and suddenly we care. We donate, we act, but strip away that identity, and our compassion fades, even when the scale of suffering multiplies beyond comprehension. Emotionally, one life feels more real than a million. This bias is weaponized constantly. Politicians use it to sway public opinion. Media outlets choose stories not based on severity, but on relatability. Charities put a child's face on a campaign because they know you're more likely to give to her than to a vague population in crisis. And it works, every time. But the effect has a darker consequence. It leaves countless people unseen. If their story isn't told, they're invisible. If they remain a number, their suffering doesn't register. You don't cry, you don't care, not because you're heartless, but because your heart can only stretch so far, and it stretches more for one face than it does for 1,000 shadows. This is the terrifying paradox of empathy. It's most powerful when it's least rational, and in a world full of overwhelming suffering, the ones who don't get seen don't get saved. Ambiguity Effect. The ambiguity effect is a silent saboteur of decision-making, a bias that drives us to avoid choices simply because they carry uncertainty. It doesn't matter if that uncertain option holds more potential, more reward, or even more truth. If the details are missing, if the outcome is unclear, if the risk can't be perfectly calculated, we flinch, we retreat, we choose the known path, even when it's worse. This bias is rooted in fear, not fear of failure, but fear of not knowing. The human brain craves control. It thrives on patterns, predictions, certainties, so when faced with a situation that lacks concrete data, the mind doesn't just hesitate, it panics. It tells you to steer clear. It whispers that the unknown is dangerous, even when logic says otherwise. And so, we turn our backs on the mystery and cling to what's familiar. The ambiguity effect is why people pass up promising investments, because the data feels incomplete. It's why voters reject new policies they don't fully understand. It's why job seekers avoid roles with undefined responsibilities, even if they're a perfect fit. And it's why so many people stay in stagnant relationships, unfulfilling careers, or toxic environments, not because they're good, but because they're known, because the alternative carries too many question marks. But the tragedy is this: the ambiguity effect doesn't just kill risk, it kills possibility. It stops people from starting businesses, from trying new approaches, from loving people who don't fit the mold. It convinces us that if we can't see the outcome, it must not be worth it. And so the mind trades potential for comfort. It sacrifices growth for predictability. This bias makes us mistake clarity for quality. We assume that just because one option is better defined, it's the better choice. But life doesn't work that way. The most meaningful paths, the ones with the most to offer, often come wrapped in uncertainty, in shadows, in gray areas where no one can guarantee success. The ambiguity effect doesn't shout. It quietly nudges you to play small, to choose the devil you know. And before you realize it, your world shrinks, not because you failed, but because you never dared to choose what you couldn't fully see. Distinction bias. Distinction bias is a silent manipulator, that twists your perception the moment two options are placed side by side. It forces you to fixate on differences that don't really matter, differences you would never even notice in isolation. But once you compare them directly, those small variations balloon in importance, hijacking your judgment and convincing you that one is significantly better, when in truth both might feel identical in real life. This bias doesn't appeal to reason. It exploits your obsession with comparison. You're shown two televisions, one with slightly better resolution, the other slightly cheaper. Suddenly, you're dissecting pixel counts, frame rates, minor pricing gaps, as if these tiny details will drastically affect your happiness. But weeks later, sitting on your couch, you wouldn't have noticed. You wouldn't have cared. What felt urgent and obvious in the moment fades into complete irrelevance in everyday experience. Distinction bias preys on your inability to predict satisfaction accurately. You assume that the difference between 8 GB and 16 GB of RAM, or between 4-star and 5-star hotel reviews, will impact your enjoyment more than it does. You forget that most of life is not lived in side-by-side comparisons. You forget that once a choice is made, your brain adjusts, and what once felt like a crucial difference now becomes invisible. Marketers exploit this constantly. They place 3 versions of a product side by side, knowing your brain will zero in on the minute variations and overinflate their value. You upgrade not because you need to, but because you can see the difference. And once you see it, it gnaws at you. Distinction bias doesn't sell products. It sells the illusion that small differences have big consequences. This bias can corrupt more than purchases. It affects people, careers, even self-worth. You compare yourself to others and fixate on slight advantages they have, better titles, slightly more income, marginally better looks. And in that comparison, you inflate the distance. You convince yourself they're ahead, that you're behind. But outside of that side-by-side distortion, the difference is meaningless or gone. Distinction bias doesn't sharpen your judgment. It distorts it. It tricks you into thinking that proximity makes a choice more important, when really, it just makes it more visible. Affective forecasting error. The affective forecasting error is one of the most heartbreaking flaws in the human mind, our repeated inability to accurately predict how we'll feel in the future. We imagine joy that never comes, heartbreak that doesn't last, and catastrophe where there is only inconvenience. Our emotions are always in motion, yet we try to trap them in advance, map them out like weather patterns, and almost always we're wrong. You think getting that job will finally make you feel fulfilled. You believe that if they leave, you'll never recover. You expect winning, achieving, escaping, or proving something will lock in happiness like a trophy you can keep on a shelf. But it never works that way, because the mind can project scenarios, it can imagine events, but it cannot accurately simulate the depth and nuance of future feeling. So it guesses, and in those guesses, it lies. The affective forecasting error is why we chase things that leave us empty, why we dread things that turn out fine. It's why people sacrifice years for a future moment of triumph that lands with a dull thud. Why revenge feels so satisfying in fantasy, but bitter in reality. Why heartbreak seems eternal until one day you forget how it felt to miss them. We don't just misjudge the intensity of future emotions, we misjudge their duration. This bias makes pain feel permanent and pleasure feel endless, both illusions. The truth is that we are emotional shapeshifters, far more adaptable than we give ourselves credit for. But in our forecasts, we forget that. We believe who we are in this moment is who we'll always be, and so we over-prepare for devastation, or we overvalue imagined happiness, only to arrive in the future and feel different, less, more, unexpected. This error drives toxic decisions, marriages, careers, relocations, betrayals, all made in service of a feeling we think we'll have, but never really do. It makes us cling to fantasies, fear change, avoid pain, and delay life. We become slaves to predictions that were never real to begin with. And perhaps the most painful part is this: we don't learn. Even after we're wrong, again and again, we keep trusting the same broken compass, the same flawed visions of future joy or sorrow, hoping this time we'll finally feel exactly the way we imagined. Projection bias. Projection bias is the illusion that your thoughts, preferences, emotions, and values are universal, that others must think and feel the way you do, because how could they not? It's the deeply human mistake of using your own mind as the default lens through which you judge the world. And in doing so, you misread people, ruin relationships, and walk blindly through conflict, never realizing that the only reflection you're seeing is your own. This bias doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from instinct. We are so intimately familiar with our own inner world that we assume it is the baseline. If you hate confrontation, you assume others avoid it too. If you would never lie in a certain situation, you believe no one else would either. If something hurts you, then it must hurt others. But people aren't mirrors. They are galaxies of experience, trauma, upbringing, and wiring. And yet, projection bias erases all that. It reduces the complexity of others down to a copy of you. It damages empathy because instead of trying to understand how someone actually feels, you assume you already know. You don't ask what they need. You give them what you would want. You don't respect their silence. You project your own reasons onto it. And when their behavior doesn't align with your inner logic, you become confused, hurt, or even angry. How could they do that? I would never. But that's the point. They aren't you. Projection bias also infects communication. It convinces you that your words are clear because you know what you meant. It makes you expect gratitude, sorrow, excitement, or loyalty based on your emotional blueprint, not theirs. And when you don't get the reaction you expect, you misjudge them as cold, irrational, selfish, or broken, when in truth, they are simply different. The most damaging part is that this bias feels so reasonable. It wears the skin of empathy when it's actually the death of it. Because real empathy isn't assuming others feel like you, it's knowing they don't. It's surrendering your lens to truly understand theirs. Projection bias is the comfort of staying in your own mind, but growth begins the moment you leave it. False uniqueness bias. The false uniqueness bias is the quiet ego behind humility, the belief that your strengths, your talents, your values are rare, that your loyalty, your compassion, your sense of justice set you apart, that others just don't care as deeply, don't try as hard, don't understand as well. It tells you you're special, not because of your flaws, but because of your virtues, and that belief can be intoxicating. At first glance, it seems harmless, even flattering. Who wouldn't want to believe they're more ethical than average, more creative than most, more driven, more selfless, more principled? But beneath that comforting illusion lies a subtle form of disconnection, because when you believe your goodness is uncommon, you start to see others as lacking. You start to build a quiet wall between yourself and the rest of the world. I'm not like them. This bias leads to resentment. You feel unrecognized, unappreciated, overlooked, not because others aren't kind or talented or good, but because you assume they can't be on your level. You see your generosity as extraordinary, your sacrifices as unmatched, your intelligence as unique. So when others succeed, it feels unfair. When they don't meet your moral standards, it feels like proof. And when they mirror your values, it somehow feels less genuine than your own. The false uniqueness bias is a thief in relationships. It whispers that you're the one who loves harder, gives more, understands deeper, that you care more than they ever could. And so your needs grow quietly disproportionate because deep down you believe you're carrying more emotional weight, more effort, more virtue. And when that isn't recognized, the bitterness spreads like poison. In truth, This bias doesn't just distort how you see others, it distorts how you receive others. It blinds you to the kindness in people who express it differently. It makes you overlook brilliance that doesn't match your own style. It creates loneliness in crowds and isolation in connection, because when you convince yourself you're standing alone in a world full of mediocrity, you forget to notice how many are standing beside you, quietly extraordinary in their own way. And so, the very belief that you are one of a kind becomes the reason you fail to truly belong. Curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is a cruel cognitive trap, a silent arrogance that creeps in the moment you understand something deeply. It's the inability to remember what it was like before you knew. Once an idea becomes clear to you, it becomes almost impossible to imagine that it was ever confusing. You forget the struggle, you forget the questions, and worst of all, you forget that others still don't know what you now take for granted. This bias distorts communication. It makes teachers impatient, leaders unclear, and experts terrible at explaining the very things they've mastered. You gloss over crucial steps because they feel obvious. You use jargon, analogies, or shortcuts that only make sense if someone already understands the foundation. You say, "It's simple," and when someone doesn't get it, you secretly judge them, not for being uninformed, but for not thinking like you. You forget that knowledge isn't just information. It's layers of context, experience, trial, and error, and not everyone has walked your path. The curse of knowledge creates distance between people. It drives wedges between parents and children, doctors and patients, coders and users, managers and teams. It makes those who know feel frustrated, and those who don't feel stupid. But the stupidity isn't real. It's projected. It's a shadow cast by the expert who has forgotten what it's like to be a beginner. This bias also poisons empathy. When you've internalized an idea, when it feels second nature, you struggle to understand why others don't behave in ways that now seem obvious to you. You expect people to act on information they've never been given, or make choices they aren't yet equipped to make. You think their failures are irrational, when really they're just operating from a knowledge gap you no longer recognize. What makes the curse of knowledge so dangerous is that it hides inside competence. It grows stronger as you become more skilled, and unless you actively remember what it was like to not know, you'll become unable to teach, to lead, to connect. You'll live in a world of your own understanding, clear to you, but fog to everyone else. And you'll mistake their confusion for failure instead of seeing it for what it truly is, a chance to remember where you started. Just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis is a seductive lie the mind tells itself to feel safe, that the world is fair, that people get what they deserve, that goodness is always rewarded and cruelty always punished. It's the belief that life operates on some moral scoreboard, that justice is woven into the fabric of the universe, invisible but absolute. It feels comforting, reassuring, and it's dead wrong. This bias begins early, often in childhood, when we're taught that being good leads to good outcomes, that hard work pays off, that the bully gets caught, that karma keeps its promises. But the real world doesn't work like that. People suffer for no reason. Liars prosper, innocents are punished, and the mind, unable to cope with this chaos, reaches for the illusion they must have done something to deserve it. It shows up when someone loses everything to illness or tragedy, and people quietly wonder what choices led them there. It whispers when a victim comes forward, and instead of compassion, they're met with suspicion. What were they wearing? Why didn't they leave? Maybe they brought it on themselves. Because admitting that bad things happen to good people means admitting it could happen to you, and the human psyche will do anything to avoid that truth. This bias poisons empathy. It creates distance. You begin to view others not as fellow human beings caught in a storm, but as flawed characters in a morality play. Their suffering becomes a lesson. Their pain becomes deserved, And in doing so, your sense of safety remains intact because you're good and therefore nothing bad will happen to you, right? But this illusion doesn't just shield you from fear, it blinds you to injustice. It makes you overlook corruption, tolerate inequality, ignore suffering. It makes you cold, because if everyone gets what they deserve, then why help anyone at all? And perhaps the darkest truth is this: when tragedy does strike you, suddenly, brutally, without reason, you won't know how to make sense of it, because the just world hypothesis will turn on you. It will whisper that you must have failed, that you must deserve it, and in that moment, the lie you believe to feel safe will become the very thing that breaks you. Ostrich Effect. The Ostrich Effect is a deeply self-destructive bias, the instinct to bury your head in the sand when faced with uncomfortable truths, just as the mythical ostrich hides from danger by pretending it doesn't exist. It's the refusal to look, the willful blindness, the desperate belief that if you don't see the problem, maybe it won't be real, maybe it'll go away, but it never does, and the longer you ignore it, the more damage it causes. This bias shows up in the moments we dread the most: checking a failing bank account, opening medical results, reading the message we've been avoiding. It's the unopened bill, the unread email, the scale you refuse to step on. You know the information might be bad, so you convince yourself not knowing is safer, but it's not. It's just delayed suffering, and often it makes the situation worse than it ever needed to be. The Ostrich Effect is driven by fear, shame, and the illusion of control. When reality threatens your sense of security, your brain defends itself by pretending the threat isn't there. It numbs you with distraction. It whispers, "You can deal with this later," but later never feels right, and so you sink deeper into denial, building a fragile bubble around your life while the pressure outside keeps rising. This bias doesn't just sabotage individuals, it poisons entire systems. Leaders ignore early signs of crisis because they fear panic. Companies downplay failing strategies because admitting them feels like weakness. Families avoid hard conversations, hoping silence will somehow fix what honesty could have healed. But denial never protects. It only delays the truth, and by then, the damage has multiplied. The cruel irony is that the information we avoid is often exactly what we need to move forward, but fear makes us turn away, and so we live in ignorance, not out of stupidity, but out of pain, out of the belief that avoiding the bad news will shield us from its consequences. But the longer we look away, the more powerless we become, because what you refuse to face will grow in the dark until it forces you to look, when it's already too late. Hedonic Treadmill. The hedonic treadmill is the quiet despair behind every dream that comes true. It is the reason joy fades, why satisfaction slips through your fingers, why even after achieving the things you once thought would finally make you happy, you find yourself right back where you started, chasing the next thing. It's not because you're ungrateful, it's because your brain is wired to adapt, and that adaptation, once a survival tool, has become your emotional trap. When something wonderful happens, falling in love, getting promoted, moving into your dream home, you feel a surge of happiness. It's real and it's intense, but over time it fades, not because the experience has changed, but because you have. Your mind recalibrates, the extraordinary becomes normal, the dream becomes routine, and that emotional high you were chasing, it dissolves like mist. This phenomenon works both ways. You lose something, you fail, you suffer, and it devastates you. But time moves on, and slowly, so do you. The pain dulls. Your mind, just as it did with happiness, adjusts to the darkness, and once again, you return to baseline, numb, steady, unsatisfied. The hedonic treadmill traps people in an endless loop of pursuit: more money, better body, bigger house, new partner. Each milestone feels like the answer. This will be the one that finally brings lasting happiness, but it never is. Because your mind isn't built for arrival. It's built for movement, for craving, for wanting. And so, the treadmill keeps running, you keep chasing, and the finish line never comes. This bias is why lottery winners return to the same emotional state within months, why heartbreak that seems unbearable eventually becomes background noise. It's why people who seem to have it all often feel nothing, because happiness, when tied to external outcomes, is always temporary, always slipping, always just out of reach. But perhaps the cruelest part is how easily the hedonic treadmill disguises itself as hope. It fuels ambition, drive, the refusal to settle, but beneath it lies a haunting truth. If you're not careful, you'll spend your life running toward happiness, never realizing it's not ahead of you. It's already gone, and the treadmill never stops. Hyperbolic discounting is a deeply human flaw, the irrational impulse to chase what feels good now, even when waiting would bring you so much more. It's the quiet voice inside your head that says, "Why wait?" even as you watch yourself sabotage long-term goals for short-term relief. It's the reason people drown in debt for fleeting pleasures, abandon diets for a moment of flavor, and destroy futures for a taste of now. This bias makes the value of future rewards fade the further away they are. $100 a year from now sounds good until someone offers you $20 today. You know the future reward is better. You can do the math, but your brain doesn't care. It doesn't want logic. It wants dopamine, and it wants it now. Hyperbolic discounting doesn't just affect your wallet. It seeps into every corner of your life. It's why people ghost on responsibilities, skip workouts, procrastinate for hours, and say, "just one more episode," when they promised themselves they'd sleep early. In that moment, the long-term benefit feels too abstract, too far away. But the short-term hit, it's right there, tangible, soothing, addictive. This bias hijacks discipline. It makes you betray your future self again and again. You plan to save money but buy impulsively. You swear to start tomorrow but keep restarting. And the worst part? Each time you give in, you know you're choosing less. But your brain feeds you just enough justification to feel okay about it. I've earned this. Just this once. It's not that big of a deal, but it is, because small choices compound. And over time, those tiny trades for instant pleasure become a life shaped by avoidance, not intention. Hyperbolic discounting is why we mortgage our futures for comfort, why short-term cravings ruin long-term dreams. It turns patience into suffering and discipline into punishment. It rewires your sense of time and value until you can't trust yourself to do what's best, even when you want to. It's not weakness, it's biology. But that doesn't make it any less dangerous, because every moment you choose now over later, you teach your brain that the future doesn't matter. And eventually, that belief becomes your reality. Misinformation Effect. The misinformation effect is a terrifying betrayal from the very thing you trust most, your memory. It's the phenomenon where your recollection of an event becomes contaminated by false or misleading information you're exposed to afterward. And once your memory changes, you believe it with the same conviction you believe anything else. That's what makes it so dangerous. You don't remember incorrectly. You remember wrong things as if they were real. This isn't just forgetting, it's distortion, subtle, surgical, invisible. It happens when you hear someone else's version of the story, see a news report with slanted language, or absorb the wrong detail in a question. Your brain doesn't tag the falsehood as foreign. It merges it into your memory. And once merged, it feels like it's always been there. It becomes part of your truth. You'll swear the car was blue when it was green. You'll remember the thief holding a gun when they never did. You'll insist someone said something they never said. And you'll pass lie after lie as fact, without ever knowing your mind has been hacked. The misinformation effect is especially cruel because it doesn't just happen to the gullible. It happens to everyone, to eyewitnesses, to victims, to experts. In courtrooms, it sends innocent people to prison. In relationships, it twists arguments into impossible knots, each person convinced they remember it exactly right. In history, it reshapes collective memory, painting false narratives that become hard to undo, all because someone planted the wrong seed at the right moment. This bias can be weaponized. Manipulators know how easily a memory can be bent. All it takes is a leading question, a suggestive tone, a fabricated detail spoken with enough confidence. If they can control the information you think you heard, they can control the way you remember what happened. And once your memory shifts, no amount of evidence will make it feel false. The most haunting part, once your mind rewrites the story, the original is lost. Memory isn't a recording, it's a reconstruction. And with each retelling, it warps further, until one day you're defending something that never happened, not because you're lying, but because your memory is. System Justification Bias. System Justification Bias is the quiet surrender to the way things are, a psychological reflex that makes people defend and rationalize the status quo, even when it harms them. It's the inner voice that whispers, "That's just how the world works." Not because it's true, but because believing otherwise would be too painful, too destabilizing, too overwhelming. This bias convinces us that existing social, political, or economic systems are fair, legitimate, and deserved, even when they're cruel, corrupt, or broken. It tells the poor they just didn't work hard enough. It tells the oppressed that they're being dramatic. It tells the angry to calm down and the dissatisfied to stop complaining. It silences rebellion by turning resignation into virtue. People don't adopt this belief out of ignorance. They adopt it for psychological survival. Questioning the system means questioning everything you've ever been told about fairness, success, justice, and morality. It means admitting the game is rigged, that the ladder you're climbing is leaned against a rotten wall, and for many, that truth is unbearable. So the mind does something terrifying. It rewrites the story to make the system seem just. It shifts blame from institutions to individuals. It praises suffering as noble and punishes outrage as entitlement. This is why victims often defend their abusers, why workers protect the companies that exploit them, why people internalize racism, sexism, and inequality rather than resist them. It's why a person struggling under a system still believes in it, because challenging it means stepping into chaos, and chaos is more frightening than oppression dressed up as order. System justification bias is the reason revolutions are so rare and apathy is so common. It's not just about fear, it's about identity. People don't just want to believe the system works. They need to, because if the system is unjust, then maybe their hard work didn't matter. Maybe their suffering wasn't noble. Maybe their place in the world is not the result of merit, but of manipulation. And that kind of disillusionment can break a person. So instead, they cling to the illusion. They defend the very forces that hold them down, not because they love the system, but because they fear what it would mean if it were a lie. Normalcy Bias. The normalcy bias is a quiet, paralyzing lie that whispers in the face of chaos. This can't be happening. It's the belief that because things have always been a certain way, they'll continue to be that way, even when all signs scream otherwise. It is the dangerous illusion that normal life will persist, even as disaster breathes down your neck. This bias doesn't just delay action, it destroys it. When faced with looming catastrophe, a hurricane approaching, a virus spreading, a financial collapse, a war erupting, most people don't run. They don't prepare. They freeze. They minimize. They tell themselves it's being exaggerated, that someone would have warned them by now, that things like this don't happen here, not to people like me. The normalcy bias is why crowds sit calmly while buildings burn, why families stay in their homes as floodwaters rise, why entire societies fail to act until it's too late. It's not that people don't see the danger, it's that their brains won't let them believe it, because believing it would shatter the structure they've built their lives upon, the illusion of safety, predictability, routine. It's a defense mechanism, a psychological sedative. Your brain, desperate to protect you from panic, blinds you to reality. You search for signs that things are okay, dismiss anything that suggests otherwise. The mind clings to the familiar because the unfamiliar feels like death, and in that moment, denial becomes more comforting than truth. But the price is high. Precious time is lost. Warnings are ignored. Lives are gambled, not because of recklessness, but because of refusal. Refusal to imagine that the world might shift beneath your feet, that the rules might change, that the life you know could end, not with a warning, but with a wave, a blast, a cough, a siren. The normalcy bias doesn't just live in disasters, it lives in relationships that are falling apart, careers on the verge of collapse, systems that are cracking under pressure. You tell yourself things will go back to normal, even as normal slips further away each day. And by the time you finally accept that something is happening, it already has. Sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is emotional gravity. It's the weight of everything you've already poured into a bad choice. Time, money, love, pride, dragging you deeper into something you should have left behind. It's the voice that says, "You've come this far, don't quit now," even when you know it's over, even when staying is costing more than leaving ever would. This fallacy is what keeps people in toxic relationships, dead-end jobs, doomed projects. You've invested so much, sacrificed so much, endured so much. How could you walk away now? Quitting feels like admitting it was all for nothing, that you were wrong, that you wasted something precious, and so you stay. Not because you believe things will improve, but because you can't bear to let go of what's already gone. The fallacy doesn't live in logic, it lives in regret. You're not trying to save the future, you're trying to save the past. You're trying to make all those sleepless nights, those bruised egos, those empty bank accounts mean something, but they already happened. The cost is already sunk, and clinging to them only pulls you further under. This trap thrives on pride, on ego, on fear of failure. But the brutal truth is this: staying doesn't undo the mistake, it deepens it. It adds another layer of pain onto something that already hurts. And the more you invest, the harder it becomes to admit you should have walked away earlier. It's a vicious loop, one that ends not with redemption, but with exhaustion. The sunk cost fallacy doesn't ask, "What's best for me now?" It asks, "How do I justify the pain I've already survived?" And in doing so, it blinds you to the freedom waiting on the other side of letting go. Illusion of control. The illusion of control is a comforting lie dressed as power, the belief that you have influence over things that are, in truth, far beyond your reach. It's the silent conviction that if you just try hard enough, plan carefully enough, worry long enough, you can steer fate. That randomness can be tamed, that chaos can be outmaneuvered, that life, in all its brutal unpredictability, will obey your will if you tighten your grip. But the world doesn't work like that. Storms still hit, loved ones still leave, accidents happen in an instant, people betray, systems collapse, diseases spread, economies crash, and yet you pace the floor at night believing that your worry is a form of preparation, that your rituals, your habits, your control-freak routines are keeping disaster at bay. This bias shows up in the smallest of places, pressing a button in an elevator repeatedly, thinking it will arrive faster, blowing on dice before a roll, holding on to lucky routines during interviews, games, negotiations, but it also shows up in much darker ways, micromanaging others to the point of pushing them away, refusing to delegate because only you can get it right, trying to fix people, to save relationships, to prevent heartbreak, by overextending your influence where it doesn't belong. And when things go wrong, because they always will, you blame yourself. You assume you missed a detail, made the wrong choice, didn't try hard enough, because it's easier to believe you had control and lost it than to accept you never had it at all. That's the heartbreaking truth behind the illusion. It feeds guilt when things fall apart, not acceptance. This bias convinces you that life is a game you can win if you just play it smart enough. That misfortune is something that happens to the careless, the unprepared, the unaware, not you. But randomness doesn't play favorites, and control, for all its seduction, is often just the fantasy we use to cope with a world we cannot command. The illusion of control doesn't make you powerful, it makes you exhausted, forever tightening your grip on things that were never in your hands to begin with. Effort justification. Effort justification is the mind's way of making pain feel meaningful. It's the bias that convinces you something is more valuable, more worthy, more real, simply because it was hard to get. The more you suffer, the more you convince yourself it was worth it. Not because it actually was, but because the alternative is unbearable. The idea that you endured all that effort for something hollow. It shows up in countless forms. The unpaid internship that broke your spirit, but you call it character building. The relationship that drained you, but you insist it taught you what love is. The degree you earned in something you no longer care about, but you defend it like it's sacred. The pain becomes the proof. You tell yourself, it had to matter. Look how much it cost me. This bias is a cruel survival instinct. It rewrites suffering into significance. Because if you admit that what you worked for wasn't worth it, you're left with nothing but regret. So your brain builds value where there is none. It polishes pain into pride. It turns wasted years into life lessons, broken dreams into necessary sacrifices. And just like that, you've tricked yourself into treasuring your own torment. Effort justification is why cults, fraternities, and elite groups use harsh initiation rituals. The more someone is made to suffer to get in, the more they believe the group is special. It's why people defend toxic companies after surviving burnout. Why students convince themselves they love the class that crushed them. Because once you've bled for something, your mind demands it be worth bleeding for. And it doesn't stop there. This bias keeps you locked in. The more effort you put in, the harder it becomes to leave, because leaving would mean admitting you chose wrong. So you double down, you push harder, you dig deeper into the very thing that's draining you. You don't realize the effort isn't proving value, it's just burying the truth. Effort justification doesn't just distort how we view the past, it chains us to it. It makes us proud of wounds we should have walked away from. And it turns endurance into a false badge of honor, even when the prize was never worth the pain. Reactance. Reactance is the fierce wind that rises whenever your freedom feels cornered. The visceral urge to push back, to defy, to do exactly what you're told not to do, simply to prove you still can. It's the child who tastes soap after being warned, the teenager who speeds up when the road sign says slow, the adult who rejects advice that might save them because the suggestion alone sounds like a shackle. The moment a command, rule, or even gentle guidance brushes against your autonomy, an ancient flame ignites. No one owns me. This instinct is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's the mind's immune system guarding personal agency. Throughout evolution, survival often meant resisting domination, keeping authority at arm's length so decisions stayed your own. That reflex still lives in modern veins, roaring whenever autonomy seems threatened. A polite "you must" can trigger psychological sirens louder than any alarm, convincing you that non-compliance is oxygen. Reactance doesn't measure the wisdom of a rule. It measures how trapped you feel under it. Ban a book and suddenly everyone wants to read it. Mandate a behavior and watch non-conformity swell. The more forceful the boundary, the hotter the instinct to breach it. Marketers exploit this with limited edition tags, knowing scarcity tastes like forbidden fruit. politicians spark it in opponents by framing policies as unavoidable edicts. In relationships, ultimatums can backfire spectacularly because telling someone they have to stay is the quickest way to make them leave. Yet reactance is a double-edged sword. It safeguards individuality, but it also tricks you into sabotaging yourself. You'll refuse help that could heal you, skip opportunities that demand compliance, cling to harmful habits just to assert they're your choice. The need to prove independence can outweigh the need to prosper, and afterward, regret arrives wearing the uniform of freedom you thought you were defending. The cruel beauty of reactance is that it flourishes in silence. No one needs to chain you. They only need to hint at control, and your own psychology does the rest, slamming doors, burning bridges, declaring victory over an enemy that was often just a caring hand, mistaken for a cage. Pessimism Bias. Pessimism bias is the storm cloud your mind paints over the future, the belief that things will go wrong, that danger is imminent, that failure is more likely than success. It convinces you to brace for impact, even when there's no sign of a crash. It turns uncertainty into threat and possibility into something to be feared. This bias doesn't whisper, it shouts. It tells you not to try, because you'll only embarrass yourself, not to love, because you'll only be hurt, not to hope, because hope is fragile and disappointment is inevitable. It cloaks itself in the illusion of wisdom, of realism. I'm not being negative, it says, I'm just being careful. But underneath that caution lies fear, raw, relentless, and deeply human. Pessimism bias is born from pain, from betrayal, from failures that left scars. It tells you the worst-case scenario is not only possible, it's probable, that the job won't call back, that the treatment won't work, that the people you care about will leave, change, or die. And once that mindset settles in, your brain becomes an architect of catastrophe, constantly rehearsing losses that haven't happened yet. It creates paralysis. You stop reaching, stop building, stop connecting, because the imagined pain becomes more powerful than the actual risk. And soon, you're living in a future that hasn't arrived, defending yourself from heartbreaks that may never come. You tell yourself it's smart to expect the worst, so you won't be surprised. But that's the lie. You will still hurt. You'll just suffer twice, once in anticipation and once if it actually happens. This bias becomes a cage. It doesn't protect you. It shrinks you. It kills joy before it can grow. It poisons relationships with doubt, strangles dreams with hesitation, and buries ambition under layers of imagined failure. And all the while, you think you're being safe, but what you're really doing is surrendering to a world that only exists in your mind. Pessimism bias doesn't stop bad things from happening. It just makes good things harder to believe in. And eventually, it convinces you that joy is naive and suffering is what makes you smart. Optimism bias. Optimism bias is a beautiful lie with sharp edges. The deep-rooted belief that bad things happen, yes, but not to you. It's the quiet conviction that danger will miss, that illness won't knock on your door, that accidents, betrayal, failure, tragedy, those are things for other people, not because you're invincible, but because your mind insists you're safe, even when you're not. This bias is woven into our biology, a defense mechanism that keeps us moving forward in a world laced with uncertainty. Without it, fear would paralyze us. We'd never fall in love, take risks, start businesses, or bring children into a chaotic world. Optimism bias keeps hope alive, but hope, unchecked, can turn into blindness, and that's when it becomes dangerous. It whispers in your ear as you speed a little too fast down the highway, "I won't crash." It echoes when you skip the doctor again, "It's probably nothing." It lingers when you ignore red flags in someone you love. "They wouldn't hurt me." It's what convinces you that the layoffs won't affect you, that the storm won't hit your house, that the addiction won't get out of hand, that the rules don't quite apply to your life. And when something does go wrong, when the diagnosis comes, when the car flips, when the job disappears, when the person you trusted becomes a stranger, you feel blindsided, betrayed not just by the world, but by your own mind, because you truly believed you were exempt. The optimism wasn't forced, it felt real, and so the crash hits harder. This bias also keeps people numb to the suffering of others. If you believe bad outcomes are rare or that they only happen to people who made poor choices, it's easier to dismiss tragedy, to blame victims, to insulate yourself in false superiority. That would never be me, but it could, and someday it might. Optimism bias doesn't just underestimate risk, it overestimates control. It tells you that good outcomes are deserved, that bad ones can be avoided with enough planning, positivity, or purity. And in doing so, it sets you up to be both overconfident and unprepared, all while smiling sweetly and promising everything's going to be fine. Base rate neglect. Base rate neglect is the moment your brain abandons logic for the comfort of a story. It's the bias that makes you ignore cold, statistical truths in favor of vivid, emotionally charged examples, because numbers don't move us, but stories do, even if they're rare, even if they're misleading, even if they're dead wrong. This bias is what makes someone terrified to fly after hearing about a plane crash, despite knowing that flying is statistically far safer than driving. It's why a single sensational news report about a crime can spark mass panic, even if crime rates are historically low. It's why one friend's bad reaction to a vaccine can outweigh thousands of clinical trials in your mind. When you're emotionally struck by a specific case, the broader reality becomes invisible. Base rate neglect is the enemy of reason. It pulls you into the dramatic, the exceptional, the unlikely. Your mind grabs onto the one horror story, the one lucky break, the one time it all went wrong or right, and builds your entire worldview around it. You forget how many times it didn't happen, how rare the event truly is, because your brain doesn't crave truth, it craves certainty wrapped in emotion. This is how myths spread, how prejudice takes root, how conspiracy theories flourish. A single dramatic anecdote becomes proof of a widespread problem, and facts, they feel cold, distant, powerless in the face of a good story. Base rate neglect is what causes doctors to misdiagnose based on an unusual symptom they once saw. It's why gamblers chase wins after hearing about someone who hit the jackpot. It's why hiring managers reject qualified candidates based on one bad gut feeling. It doesn't matter what the data says. What matters is that one time. And this bias is not about stupidity. It's about emotion. Stories stick. They're vivid, human, raw. Statistics are faceless. And so we build our beliefs, fears, and decisions around the exception, not the rule. The result? We walk through life with a warped sense of risk, of probability, of reality. And in doing so, we mistake the loudest truth for the truest one, falling for the story and forgetting the world. Gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is a seductive illusion, the belief that chance has a memory, that randomness somehow keeps score, that if the roulette wheel has landed on black 5 times in a row, red is now due, that a losing streak must turn into a win, that the universe owes you something simply because it hasn't paid out yet. This bias preys on our deep hunger for patterns. The human brain cannot tolerate chaos. It wants meaning, order, predictability. So when we face randomness, true randomness, our minds rebel. We imagine rhythms where there are none. We tell ourselves that the coin, the dice, the odds must balance out, but they don't. The roulette wheel doesn't care what happened last spin. The lottery machine doesn't know your numbers are overdue. Chance is mercilessly indifferent. The gambler's fallacy leads people into ruin, not just in casinos, but in life. It keeps you stuck in bad relationships, thinking it's been hard for so long, it has to get better soon. It traps investors in failing ventures, After all these losses, the next one has to hit. It convinces people to take irrational risks, doubling down not because the odds are in their favor, but because their emotions are screaming for justice, for karma, for balance. But the universe doesn't work that way. Random events don't compensate for each other. Each coin flip is clean. Each roll is fresh. There's no invisible force keeping the score fair. And yet, people lose fortunes and years of their lives waiting for the scales to tip back. The cruel part of the gambler's fallacy is that it feels rational. It feels like strategy, like intuition, like the odds are turning and you're just smart enough to spot it. But what you're really doing is bargaining with chaos. You're trying to make chance fair when it was never meant to be. And when the losses pile up, when reality doesn't bend to your hopes, you don't stop, you chase. Because to admit it was all random would be to admit you were never in control. And that truth is often more unbearable than the loss itself. Neglect of probability. Neglect of probability is the mind's refusal to do the math, an emotional override that pushes statistics aside and lets fear, hope, or instinct take the wheel. It's what happens when we know the odds, but act like we don't. We see the numbers, we understand the likelihood, but we make decisions based on how it feels, not how it adds up. This bias is why someone buys a lottery ticket and believes deep down this could be the one, despite the 1 in millions odds. It's why a parent refuses to let their child walk to school alone, even though the risk of abduction is vanishingly small. It's why people spend thousands insuring things that are easily replaceable, while ignoring the slow, creeping risks that are far more likely to destroy their lives, like stress, addiction, or unhealthy habits. The mind doesn't evaluate danger or reward based on numbers. It evaluates based on emotion. If something feels terrifying, we act like it's probable. If something feels safe, we assume it's rare for anything to go wrong. This is why flying feels scarier than driving, why terrorism makes headlines while heart disease quietly kills millions, why rare side effects from medicine get more attention than the life-saving impact they statistically offer. Neglect of probability doesn't just distort personal decisions, it skews entire systems. Public policy shaped by fear instead of fact. Court rulings influenced by gut reactions instead of risk analysis. It leads to overreactions to rare threats and dangerous complacency around common ones, because the mind can't hold a percentage the way it holds a story. You don't feel a 0.1% chance. You feel a pit in your stomach or a rush of relief, and that's what you obey. This bias is why the world seems more dangerous than it is, why we chase fantasy payoffs and avoid tiny risks like their death sentences. It's not that we don't understand probability, it's that we emotionally reject it, and in doing so, we end up fearing the wrong things, trusting the wrong promises, and gambling our futures on feelings dressed up as facts. Outcome bias. Outcome bias is a cruel distortion of judgment, a mental trap that convinces you a decision was good because it turned out well, or bad because it ended in failure, regardless of how sound or foolish the actual process behind it was. It punishes wisdom when luck runs out and rewards recklessness when chance decides to play nice. It confuses results with reasoning, and in doing so, it buries truth under the weight of hindsight. This bias thrives in a world obsessed with winners. The startup that gambled everything and succeeded is hailed as visionary, even if their decisions were reckless, even if it was a 1 in a million shot. Meanwhile, the careful, thoughtful entrepreneur who failed due to timing or market collapse is dismissed as incompetent. Outcome bias doesn't care about nuance. It worships results, and in its eyes, if you lost, you must have done something wrong. It infects relationships, careers, parenting, leadership. You make a decision based on all the information you had, on intuition, experience, logic. But if it ends badly, even if it was the right call, you're judged. You judge yourself. I should have known. I made a mistake. But sometimes you didn't. Sometimes you made the best decision possible and still lost. And then there's the darker mirror, when you win through luck but mistake it for skill. The night you drove drunk and made it home. The deal you closed on a gut feeling that could have ruined you. The time you lied, cheated, cut corners, and came out ahead. Outcome bias whispers, you did the right thing, but you didn't. You just got away with it. This bias blinds us to truth in others too. We judge leaders based on how things turned out, not on the impossible conditions they navigated. We condemn parents for how their children turn out, ignoring the chaos and complexity of raising a human being. We punish doctors for outcomes they couldn't control. We blame, reward, shame, or celebrate, not based on wisdom, but on fate. Outcome bias turns life into a rigged trial where the verdict is written after the fact. It erases the courage of good decisions that ended in pain, and it turns lucky survivors into false prophets, preaching methods that were never safe to follow in the first place. Planning fallacy. The planning fallacy is the cruel optimism that poisons your calendar, your promises, and your peace of mind. It's the delusional belief that this time you'll get it done faster, that this project won't spiral, that you won't run out of energy, hit a wall, or get derailed by life's quiet chaos. You map out the future in clean, manageable blocks, completely detached from how reality actually unfolds. This bias tricks you not just once, but every time. You tell yourself you've learned, you pad the deadline, you schedule the breaks, you promise not to procrastinate, and still, you find yourself racing the clock, cutting corners, explaining delays, because your brain isn't planning based on your past performance, it's planning based on fantasy, on your ideal self, focused, efficient, free from distraction, immune to fatigue. That version of you doesn't exist, but it's the one making all your plans. The planning fallacy affects individuals, teams, even entire industries. Governments overshoot budgets by billions. Tech startups promise launches in months and deliver years later. Students swear they can finish the paper the night before, and people keep building to-do lists that stretch into the impossible, then crumble under their own weight. It's not just poor planning, it's hope disguised as confidence. This bias thrives on shame. When you fall short, you blame yourself. You call it laziness, weakness, a lack of discipline. You don't see the real villain, the illusion baked into your mental wiring. So you try harder next time, push more, sleep less, and still it collapses. And the heartbreak is this: the more ambitious you are, the more this bias cuts you. Big dreams demand long roads, but the planning fallacy makes those roads look shorter than they are, leading you to underestimate the stamina you'll need. So you sprint toward what should have been a marathon and burn out halfway there. The planning fallacy doesn't just waste your time, it erodes your self-trust. It convinces you that you're the problem, when in truth, your vision was sabotaged by a mind that refuses to see the full cost of reality. And by the time you realize it, you're late, exhausted, and still wondering why. Authority bias. Authority bias is the quiet surrender of your own judgment, the deep-seated tendency to believe, obey, and follow someone simply because they hold power, not because their ideas are sound, not because their morals are pure, but because they wear a title, a uniform, a confident tone. It is the reflex to trust the expert without question, to silence your doubts when someone important speaks, and to mistake status for truth. This bias is wired into us. From childhood, we are taught to respect authority. Parents, teachers, leaders. We learn that defiance brings punishment and obedience brings approval. Over time, that pattern becomes automatic. A person in charge speaks and we nod. We comply. We assume they know better, even when they don't. Authority bias is why patients follow doctors' advice without understanding the treatment. It's why soldiers obey commands that betray their conscience. It's why juries give more weight to a polished expert than a shaky eyewitness. It's why entire organizations follow toxic leaders into ruin because no one dares question the voice at the top. And it's not just obedience, it's reverence. Once someone is seen as an authority, their mistakes are downplayed, their flaws are forgiven, their lies are rationalized. You second-guess your instincts because they must be right. After all, they're the boss, the professor, the officer, the politician. You silence your inner voice, not because it's wrong, but because it's yours, and theirs sounds more official. This bias is ruthlessly exploited. Manipulators know that titles create submission, that people trust the man in the lab coat, the woman with the clipboard, the influencer with 1 million followers. They don't have to earn your trust. They inherit it from the role they play. And once they have it, they can steer you anywhere, into purchases, into fear, into compliance. The tragedy of authority bias is not just blind obedience. It's the slow erosion of personal agency. You stop thinking critically. You stop asking questions. You outsource your morality, your logic, your responsibility. And when the truth finally breaks through, when the authority fails or falls or is revealed to be hollow, you're left not just betrayed, but complicit, because you chose silence when your voice was needed most. Survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is the illusion built on silence, the dangerous tendency to focus only on the winners, the success stories, the survivors, while ignoring the vast, invisible graveyard of those who didn't make it. It's the startup that became a billion-dollar empire while thousands of others died quietly. It's the author whose self-published novel became a bestseller while 1 million others faded into digital dust. It's the soldier who lived to tell the tale while the dead are never interviewed. This bias doesn't feel malicious. In fact, it often feels inspiring. We celebrate the victorious. We highlight the outliers. We crave stories of those who made it against all odds. But in doing so, we distort reality. We assume that success is more common than it is, that hard work always pays off, that talent is all it takes, that risk leads to reward. Because the failures, the ones who tried just as hard, were just as smart, just as bold, never get the spotlight. Their silence becomes erasure. Survivorship bias seduces you with selective evidence. You see the entrepreneur who dropped out of college and became a billionaire, not the thousands who dropped out and fell into obscurity. You hear about the person who ignored the rules and thrived, not the many who ignored the rules and lost everything. It tricks you into thinking that because someone succeeded, their path must have been right, when in truth, it may have just been lucky. This bias infects everything: business, education, finance, art, war. It leads to overconfidence, bad bets, broken systems. It convinces you that you don't need to prepare because someone else succeeded without preparation, that you should take the risk because someone else survived it. That effort guarantees reward, when sometimes it just doesn't. And the cost of ignoring the failures, it's not just miscalculation. It's heartbreak, disillusionment, blaming yourself when you don't succeed, thinking you must have done something wrong. You didn't. You just never saw how many others tried and fell, quietly, invisibly, off stage. Survivorship bias doesn't just distort success. It buries the truth. It builds false hope on missing data. And it convinces you that you're seeing the whole picture, when in fact, you're only staring at the survivors. Actor-observer bias. The actor-observer bias is the quiet double standard stitched into every judgment we make, the tendency to explain our mistakes through circumstance while blaming others' mistakes on who they are. When you screw up, it's because you were tired, stressed, provoked. When someone else screws up, it's because they're careless, selfish, rude. Same action, different story. One makes you human, the other makes them guilty. This bias isn't born of cruelty, it's born of perspective. You see your own life from the inside. You feel your emotions, your pressures, your context. So, when you lash out or fall short, you understand the why. But with others, all you see is the outcome. You don't feel their exhaustion. You don't hear their inner monologue. You just see what they did and judge who they are because of it. It happens in relationships. You raise your voice because you were overwhelmed. They raise their voice because they're too aggressive. You're late because of traffic. They're late because they're inconsiderate. This bias builds resentment fast because both people are playing by different emotional rules, convinced the other is just wired wrong. It happens in parenting. You see your child's tantrum as disrespect, not realizing they're overstimulated, overtired, or just struggling to regulate emotions they don't yet understand. It happens in leadership. You see an employee's mistake as incompetence, not a symptom of unclear communication or burnout. It happens in politics, in culture, in conflict, where we grant ourselves complexity and grant others a label. The actor-observer bias is dangerous because it feels right. It protects your ego while sharpening your judgment of others, and it ensures you stay the hero in your story while others become the villains. But over time, it builds walls. It kills empathy. It makes you impossible to truly connect with, because no one wants to be in a world where your flaws are forgivable, but theirs are identity. And the most painful irony, everyone's doing it. They're judging you the same way you're judging them, seeing only your actions, not your reasons, writing your worst moments into your character. And unless someone breaks the cycle, both sides stay trapped, misunderstood, misjudged, and miles apart in the same room. Illusory superiority. Illusory superiority is the comforting lie that nestles in the back of your mind, telling you that you're above average, smarter than most, kinder than most, more capable, more self-aware. It's the voice that says, "I'm not like them." When you hear about human error, ignorance, or failure, it's the warm illusion that you are the exception in a world full of mediocrity. This bias is nearly universal. The majority of people believe they're better than average at driving, even though that's statistically impossible. Students rate themselves as more intelligent than their peers. Employees think they're more productive than their coworkers. Even people with objectively low performance cling to the belief that they're outperforming others. Why? Because facing the truth that we are often ordinary, flawed, inconsistent, is deeply uncomfortable. So the mind builds a shield of quiet superiority to protect our fragile self-image. Illusory superiority isn't just arrogance, it's survival. It cushions us against self-doubt. It allows us to take risks, to push forward, to feel in control. But over time, it becomes a barrier. It makes you deaf to feedback. It makes you blind to your own weaknesses. It convinces you that the problem is always them, never you, that your judgment is sound, your choices correct, your morality stronger. This bias is why relationships fracture, because each person believes they listen better, care more, communicate clearer. It's why workplaces become toxic, everyone thinking they are pulling more weight than others. It's why online arguments spiral, with every participant believing they are the rational one, surrounded by fools. The tragedy is that when everyone believes they're above average, we stop growing, because improvement begins with humility, and illusory superiority kills humility at the root. The most insidious part? This bias hides behind confidence. It looks like self-assurance. It feels like truth, but it's a mirage, because being better than average isn't the point. Being honest about where you stand is. And yet, most people would rather live in a comforting illusion than face the reality that they might be just average, just human, just as capable of failure and blindness as everyone else. And so, the lie lives on, unquestioned, unchallenged, because the truth, though freeing, requires the one thing illusory superiority cannot allow: self-awareness, self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is the ego's secret bodyguard, the reflexive instinct to take credit when things go right and shift blame when they don't. It's the voice in your head that says, I succeeded because I'm talented, but whispers, I failed because the system was rigged. It's the mental shield that protects your self-image at all costs, even if it means rewriting reality. This bias is not just a lie, it's a survival strategy. It cushions your pride, it defends your worth. When you ace an exam, it's because you're smart. When you bomb it, the questions were unfair. You get the job, you deserved it. You don't, they didn't recognize your potential. Every success confirms your value. Every failure becomes someone else's fault. And slowly, truth takes a backseat to emotional comfort. You don't notice when it happens. It's subtle, automatic. You spin the story so fast, you believe it yourself. And that's the danger, because while it feels like self-confidence, it's often just self-deception. In relationships, this bias poisons communication. You take credit for every peaceful moment and blame them for every fight. You're the patient one, the one who tries, the one who cares. They're difficult, emotional, unreasonable, and every time things go wrong, you build a case for why you did everything right. In teams, it kills accountability. When things go well, everyone wants the spotlight. When they fall apart, the fingers point outward. No one admits fault because the mind refuses to see itself as the cause of the collapse. It's always the boss, the client, the market, anyone but you. This bias even shapes your memories. You'll recall moments in a way that paints you nobler, smarter, more in control than you were. You'll forget the part you played in your own heartbreak. You'll rewrite the narrative of failure until you're the misunderstood protagonist, never the antagonist. But the most haunting cost of the self-serving bias isn't dishonesty, it's stagnation. Because if every failure is someone else's fault, you never grow, you never learn, you never confront the truth that maybe, just maybe, you weren't entirely right. And without that reckoning, your success becomes a fragile illusion, one crack away from collapse. Halo effect. The halo effect is a beautiful distortion, a psychological glow that spills from one shining trait and blinds us to the rest. It's the reason we assume someone who is attractive must also be kind, that someone who speaks eloquently must be intelligent, that a confident leader must be ethical. We don't judge the whole person. We let one golden quality cast a light over everything else, and in doing so, we see what we want to see, not what's really there. This bias begins instantly. Within seconds of meeting someone, your brain locks onto a trait, beauty, charm, warmth, status, and it anchors your entire perception. You start filling in the blanks. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You excuse red flags. That one positive trait becomes a lens, and through it, every flaw softens, every virtue brightens, even when it's not real. The halo effect is why celebrities are trusted on issues they know nothing about, why charismatic speakers get applause for empty words, why someone with a polished image can deceive for years while their victims go unheard. It's why job candidates who look the part get hired over those more qualified. Why a teacher's bias toward a well-behaved student can inflate grades. It doesn't just influence first impressions, it controls them. This bias is not limited to people. We apply it to brands, ideas, leaders, institutions. If one part looks polished, we assume the rest must be too. A product in sleek packaging seems more effective. A charity with an inspiring story must be well run. A politician who speaks well must also govern well. We stop asking questions once we're dazzled by the glow. But the danger lies in what we miss. We overlook abuse, corruption, incompetence, manipulation because we're still clinging to that one trait that made us trust, that made us feel safe, impressed, inspired. And when the illusion breaks, when the person or product or promise crumbles under scrutiny, we're left disoriented, betrayed. How could I not have seen it? The answer is simple. You didn't see them. You saw the light they cast. and you mistook the glow for the truth. That's the power of the halo effect. It doesn't just distort what we observe, it decides who we allow ourselves to truly see. Horn effect. The horn effect is a cruel distortion of perception, where one flaw, one mistake, one visible imperfection poisons your entire view of someone. You see a single crack and convince yourself the whole structure is broken. A person fumbles their words and suddenly they're incompetent. They're late once and now they're irresponsible. They dress a little unkempt and they become unprofessional. One trait, one slip, one moment, and the rest of who they are fades into the background. This bias isn't about truth. It's about how fast the human brain jumps to conclusions when it catches a scent of weakness. It turns judgment into instinct. It locks onto the negative and paints everything else in that same dark color. And once that judgment forms, it's hard to undo. You don't just see a flaw, you expect more to follow. Your mind starts looking for other faults to confirm the image you've built. The horn effect shows up in interviews, in classrooms, in dating, in friendships. A teacher sees a student slouch and assumes laziness. A manager notices hesitation in a meeting and overlooks the person's actual ideas. A stranger makes an awkward first impression and they're branded as cold, annoying, or rude before they even get a chance to show who they are. This bias is not just unfair, it's corrosive. It blinds us to nuance. It turns people into caricatures of their worst moment, and it kills empathy because once you believe someone is bad, you stop trying to understand why. You stop giving them space to be complex, human, redeemable. But perhaps the darkest truth is how easily the horn effect reflects inward. You make one mistake and can't forgive yourself. You zero in on one flaw, your weight, your anxiety, your past, and let it define your worth. You start to believe you are the worst thing about you, and that belief becomes a cage. The horn effect doesn't just distort how we see others, it distorts how we treat them. And sometimes how we treat ourselves. It is the reason reputations crumble faster than they're built, the reason second chances are so rare, and the reason one imperfect moment can become a life sentence in someone else's eyes. Group attribution error. The group attribution error is a quiet act of mental laziness, a shortcut the brain takes when it assumes that the behavior of a group reflects the nature of each individual within it. One person yells at you, and suddenly you distrust the whole team. A few extremists act violently, and now the entire community is dangerous. A single mistake by someone from that group, and you assign blame to everyone who shares their identity, background, belief, or culture. It's not reason, it's reflex. The mind craves order, categories, predictability. So instead of dealing with the complexity of individuals within a group, it paints everyone with the same brush. It's easier, faster, safer. At least that's what we tell ourselves. But what we're really doing is collapsing humanity into stereotypes, reducing people to representatives, replacing nuance with generalization. And in that act, we stop seeing people as people. This bias is the seed of bigotry. It's what allows someone to meet a rude tourist and decide an entire country is arrogant. It's what fuels racism, sexism, xenophobia, because once a single individual's action becomes a symbol, the entire group becomes a target. And from there, empathy dies. We don't judge others by who they are. We judge them by what they are and what we've decided that label means. It works in the other direction too. We see one athlete succeed and assume their whole nation is disciplined. One charity does good work and we believe everyone involved must be noble. One activist speaks wisely and we assume their followers are just as thoughtful. This bias doesn't just feed hate, it feeds false hope, blind loyalty, and misplaced trust. In everyday life, this error plays out in workplaces, schools, neighborhoods. You dislike a few people in a department, and now the whole team is difficult. A stranger cuts you off in traffic, and you blame their entire kind, their city, their car, their culture. You stop giving the benefit of the doubt. You stop listening. You stop seeing. The group attribution error thrives in ignorance. It demands no evidence, no nuance, just one story, one impression, one spark. And from there, it burns bridges you never realized you were building, all because someone else lit the match. Bandwagon Effect. The bandwagon effect is the seductive pull of the crowd, the deep psychological urge to believe, say, or do something simply because everyone else is. It's the moment you abandon your own judgment, not because you've changed your mind, but because it's easier, safer, more comfortable to fall in line. You stop asking, is this right? And start asking, is this popular? This bias doesn't announce itself with pressure. It creeps in quietly, a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing, sharing the same opinion, praising the same person, canceling the same villain, and suddenly it feels wrong to disagree, not just unpopular, wrong. And so you nod, you share, you post, you agree, not because you've thought it through, but because you don't want to be the only one who hasn't. It shows up in politics, fashion, religion, cancel culture, and conspiracy theories. A belief gains momentum, not through truth, but through numbers. The more people who believe it, the more believable it becomes. The bandwagon effect tells you that popularity equals correctness, that the crowd must know something you don't, that to stand apart is to invite ridicule, rejection, or worse, irrelevance. This bias is especially dangerous in moments of collective emotion, outrage, grief, fear, euphoria. When people are moved as one, the individual disappears. You stop being you and start being us. And once you've joined the crowd, it becomes hard to even remember what you thought before you did. Dissent becomes uncomfortable, silence becomes guilt, and suddenly the bandwagon isn't just something you're following, it's something you're defending. Marketers exploit it, politicians weaponize it, influencers thrive on it, because once something looks like a movement, people will join just to avoid being left behind. It doesn't matter if the idea is hollow. It doesn't matter if the belief is harmful. What matters is that it's popular. And in a world where visibility often matters more than truth, popularity becomes its own kind of gospel. But the most haunting part? Once the crowd changes course, when the bandwagon moves, you'll move too. And you'll barely notice you did. Because in the end, it's not the idea you were loyal to. It was the feeling of belonging, of safety, of being on the right side, even if it was never really yours to begin with. In-group bias. In-group bias is the invisible loyalty that shapes your thoughts before you even realize you're choosing sides. It's the instinctive pull to favor people who are part of your us, your family, your friends, your nation, your political party, your gender, your culture, your team. Even when the differences between groups are minor or meaningless, the mind carves a line in the sand and says, "These are my people. They matter more." This bias is not born from reason. It's built into our wiring. From an evolutionary standpoint, it made sense. Trusting your tribe meant survival. Outsiders could mean danger, disease, betrayal. So we evolved to protect our own, to cooperate within the group, to build bonds that ensured safety. But in the modern world, that same instinct quietly corrodes fairness, empathy, and justice. In-group bias shows up in small, almost invisible ways, giving the benefit of the doubt to someone who shares your beliefs, believing your team's fouls are less serious, trusting people who look like you, promoting someone because they fit in. It doesn't feel like prejudice. It feels like intuition, like loyalty, like comfort, but it's a comfort that comes at a cost. It fuels nepotism, favoritism, and echo chambers. It's why people bend rules for friends, but enforce them strictly on strangers. Why communities protect their own even when they're in the wrong. Why juries, schools, workplaces all meant to be impartial, can become skewed battlegrounds of quiet favoritism. You defend your group not necessarily because they are right, but because they are yours. And what makes this bias so dangerous is how blind it is. You rarely notice it in yourself. It hides behind warmth, connection, and shared identity. It feels righteous, protective. But while you're defending your group, someone else, someone on the outside, is being dismissed, doubted, excluded, not because of who they are, but because of where they stand. In-group bias doesn't just divide, it builds illusions. It tells you your group is more moral, more hardworking, more deserving, that others are different and maybe even less human. And from that false sense of superiority, we justify cruelty. We overlook injustice. We write off the suffering of those who don't belong, not out of hate, but out of blind devotion to those who do. Outgroup homogeneity bias. Outgroup homogeneity bias is the mind's cruel shortcut, a deep-rooted belief that people outside your group are all alike, that they think the same, act the same, vote the same, believe the same, that they are predictable, shallow, one-dimensional, that you can understand them by understanding one of them. And just like that, an entire community becomes a caricature. Meanwhile, your own group, your culture, your friends, your kind, is full of nuance. You see the complexity, the contradictions, the layers. You know that not all people like you are the same. There are exceptions, differences, gradients of belief and behavior. But when it comes to them, the other political party, the other religion, the other ethnicity, the other generation, you paint with a single unforgiving brush. This bias lives in the headlines you don't question, the jokes you let slide, the instinct to say, that's just how they are. It's how stereotypes survive, how hatred breeds, how wars are justified. It's the reason someone hears one story about a criminal from a different background and assumes it reflects an entire race. It's why one toxic tweet becomes the face of an entire movement. The mind sees a pattern, and instead of resisting it, it simplifies the world to make it more manageable. Outgroup homogeneity bias doesn't just divide, it dehumanizes. It erases identity. It tells you that the people outside your circle aren't worth knowing as individuals, that they are defined not by their thoughts or experiences, but by their category. It gives you permission to stop listening, to stop caring, to assume, and in doing so, it poisons empathy. You stop seeing a person, you see a symbol, a threat, a label, and that's where cruelty begins, not always with hatred, sometimes with indifference, with silence, with the quiet belief that their pain isn't as real as yours, their voice not as complex, their story not as worth hearing. The irony, of course, is that somewhere else, someone in their group is doing the same thing to you, and the more you both believe the other is all the same, the more alike you actually become, trapped in a cycle of fear, ignorance, and the illusion of superiority. False consensus effect. The false consensus effect is the comforting delusion that your thoughts are common, your values are shared, your worldview is the default. It's the belief that most people see things the way you do, because how could they not? Your opinions feel so rational, so obvious, so grounded in reality, that assuming others think differently feels like admitting they're irrational, ignorant, or just wrong. This bias isn't just arrogance, it's protection. Your beliefs shape your identity, your choices, your morality, your entire sense of who you are rests on the assumption that you're not alone, that your way of thinking is part of some broader truth. So your mind, desperate to shield you from isolation or doubt, fills in the gaps. It tells you, most people agree with me, most people would do the same, most people feel this way, whether it's politics, ethics, religion, lifestyle, or even petty preferences. The brain wants to believe it's swimming with the current, not against it. This effect shows up in how we vote, how we argue, how we navigate social media. It's why you're shocked when someone supports a policy you find appalling, why you're stunned when others don't speak out about an issue that feels urgent to you, why it's so easy to feel like you're part of the silent majority even when you're not, because you've surrounded yourself, consciously or not, with people who reflect your views, and that echo makes your beliefs feel universal. But this illusion doesn't just create comfort, it creates conflict. When you assume everyone sees the world the way you do, disagreement feels like betrayal, dissent feels like stupidity, and suddenly, you're not just defending your opinion, you're defending reality itself. That's how debates turn hostile, how empathy gets replaced with condescension, how societies fracture into echo chambers that glare across invisible lines, each one certain that they are the norm, and everyone else is delusional. The false consensus effect doesn't just overestimate agreement, it underestimates complexity. It erases nuance. It turns diverse humanity into a mirror, and when that mirror cracks, when the world doesn't reflect your beliefs, you're left disoriented, defensive, and utterly convinced that something must be wrong. But the only thing that's truly off is the assumption that you were never alone. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the invisible filter that distorts the world to match your beliefs. It's the reason you seek out information that agrees with you, ignore what doesn't, and twist neutral facts until they fit your narrative. It doesn't matter if you're wrong. Your brain will find a way to make you feel right, again and again and again. This bias doesn't just cloud your judgment, it protects your identity. Because beliefs aren't just ideas, they're anchors. They define your tribe, your worldview, your sense of control. Challenging them feels like stepping into a void. So instead, the mind builds a fortress. It searches for headlines, experts, statistics, anecdotes, anything that confirms what you already think. And if it doesn't find it, it manufactures it through selective memory and interpretation. You'll remember the one doctor who said what you want to hear and forget the dozens who didn't. You'll hold on to the friend's story that proves your point and ignore the data that contradicts it. You'll Google not to learn, but to win. Is X bad? Becomes why X is bad, and the algorithm happily obliges, showing you exactly what you want to see. Confirmation bias is why debates never seem to end, why people dig deeper when presented with evidence that threatens their beliefs, why cults grow stronger when criticized, why conspiracy theories spread faster than facts. It's not logic that fuels them, it's fear of being wrong, and when the truth hurts, the brain protects itself by choosing comfort over correction. It's especially dangerous because it feels like certainty. You don't feel bias, you feel informed, you feel justified, you feel awake, while others seem blind. And that illusion that you're simply seeing the truth more clearly than everyone else is how confirmation bias cements itself, quietly, powerfully, permanently. But perhaps the most tragic part, the more you fall into it, the harder it becomes to ever truly grow. Because learning requires humility, understanding requires doubt, and when your entire reality is built on only hearing what you already believe, you don't evolve, you just echo louder, but never deeper. Anchoring bias is the invisible weight chained to your first impression, the cognitive trap where the very first piece of information you receive becomes the reference point for everything that follows, no matter how irrelevant, inaccurate, or manipulative it may be. Once that anchor is dropped into your mind, it drags every future judgment toward it, distorting your decisions without you ever realizing you're being pulled. This bias is why a used car priced at $20,000 feels like a deal when the seller drops it to $16,000. Even if it's only worth $12,000, it's why a salary offer sounds generous if it's above the first number thrown out. It's why a restaurant listing a $100 steak makes the $60 one look reasonable. Your brain isn't calculating from scratch. It's adjusting from the first number you saw. even when that number was completely arbitrary. And it's not just about numbers. The first story you hear about a person becomes your anchor. The first diagnosis, the first review, the first headline, that initial input sets your frame, and even if better, truer, deeper information comes later, your mind still clings to the anchor. You adjust, but rarely enough, because the anchor doesn't just inform you, it shapes you. Anchoring bias is how manipulators play you without ever lying. They just plant the right starting point. They say, this is normal. This is what it usually costs. Most people agree with this, and suddenly, everything you evaluate is filtered through that frame. It doesn't feel like influence, it feels like context, but it's control. This bias is relentless. You're not immune to it just because you know it exists. It distorts negotiations, predictions, even self-worth. If you're told early in life you're average, you'll measure every success against that standard. If you're told you're exceptional, you might overlook your flaws. Anchors don't just affect how we judge the world, they affect how we judge ourselves. The most dangerous thing about anchoring bias, it feels logical. You think you're weighing evidence, comparing fairly, making reasoned decisions, but you're not. You're just rearranging your thoughts around whatever got there first, and mistaking that weight for truth. Availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is the mind's lazy shortcut to truth. The flawed belief that if something comes to mind easily, it must be common, likely, or important. It's the reason you fear plane crashes more than car accidents, why you overestimate the chance of being attacked by a shark but underestimate the risk of heart disease. It's not logic guiding your fear, it's memory, and the more vivid, emotional, or recent the memory, the more real the threat feels. This bias hijacks your perception without you noticing. A news story flashes across your screen, another violent crime, another disaster, another celebrity overdose, and suddenly your sense of reality shifts. It feels like those things are everywhere. It feels like the world is burning, not because of data, but because the story was shocking, memorable, and close enough to stick. You hear about one person who had a bad reaction to a vaccine, and it's burned into your brain. But the millions who were fine, forgettable, quiet, invisible. The mind doesn't weigh evidence evenly. It gives the spotlight to the loudest, scariest, most emotional examples, and it builds your beliefs from that warped highlight reel. The availability heuristic doesn't just mislead your fears, it warps your judgments in everyday life. You remember the one coworker who got rich from crypto, not the dozens who lost everything. You recall that one friend who found love on a dating app, not the hundreds of swipes, lies, and ghostings that led nowhere. You focus on the exception and believe it's the rule, because the exception is all your brain can see. This bias isn't just cognitive, it's emotional. What scares you sticks. What shocks you lingers. What hurt you last year feels more real than what could actually hurt you tomorrow. And the media, social networks, and even your own mind weaponize that emotion, turning isolated events into distorted truths. The result? You live in a world shaped not by facts, but by memories masquerading as probability. And unless you stop and ask, is this just memorable, or is it actually likely? You'll keep making decisions based not on what's real, but on what you remember feeling the most. Representativeness Heuristic. The representativeness heuristic is a mental shortcut that trades truth for resemblance, a fast, intuitive judgment that says, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. It's the instinct to evaluate people, events, or situations based on how closely they match a stereotype, rather than on logic, evidence, or probability. Your brain doesn't ask, is this likely? It asks, does this feel familiar? And in that feeling, it makes its decision. This bias is what makes you assume a quiet, bookish man is more likely to be a librarian than a truck driver, even if there are vastly more truck drivers in the world. It's why someone wearing a lab coat seems more intelligent, why someone with tattoos gets pegged as rebellious, why a well-dressed speaker is believed, even if their words are empty. The representativeness heuristic doesn't care about base rates or real statistics. It cares about fit. Does this person or scenario fit the mental mold you've already built? It's the cognitive trap that makes you judge the likelihood of an outcome by how much it resembles your idea of that outcome. If a person seems too nice, too polished, too confident, you assume they must be successful, even if there's no evidence. If someone is emotional and intense, you assume they must be in love, or lying, or dangerous, because that's how those people act in your internal script. Your brain runs the pattern, and the pattern wins. But this shortcut comes with a cruel cost. It fuels profiling, it warps justice, it leads to wrongful convictions, racial bias, and hiring discrimination. It makes people overlook the shy genius in the room and overestimate the charming fraud. It simplifies the world into categories: familiar or unfamiliar, safe or unsafe, worthy or unworthy, and leaves no room for nuance. And the most haunting part? It feels right. It feels like instinct, like gut feeling, like truth whispered from the back of your mind. But it's not truth. It's a shadow, a stereotype dressed up as certainty. And the more you trust it without question, the more you let your brain swap reality for resemblance and call it wisdom. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the mental ache that burns in the space between what you believe and what you do. It's the tension that arises when your actions don't align with your values, when your choices betray your convictions, when two truths live inside you, fighting for dominance, neither willing to surrender. It's the moment you realize something doesn't add up, and instead of fixing the contradiction, you try to live inside it. This bias isn't loud. It's uncomfortable, a subtle, gnawing discomfort that makes you shift in your seat, rationalize, rewrite, deny. You smoke even though you know it's killing you. You stay in a toxic relationship even though you believe you deserve better. You lie to protect your pride even as you preach honesty. The dissonance isn't just a clash of thoughts. It's a crack in your identity, and your mind will do almost anything to seal it shut. You tell yourself it's just this once, that everyone does it, that you had no choice. You bend your beliefs to match your actions, or you twist your actions to match your beliefs. But either way, something has to give, because the mind cannot hold contradiction for long. It aches for coherence, for peace, even if that peace is built on self-deception. Cognitive dissonance is why people double down when proven wrong, why they cling harder to bad decisions instead of walking away. Admitting a mistake isn't just humbling, it's painful. It means confronting the fact that you were not who you thought you were, and for many, that's too much to bear. This bias shows up in politics, religion, morality, love. It's why cult members dig in deeper after failed prophecies, why someone preaches kindness but explodes with cruelty behind closed doors. It's not hypocrisy, it's inconsistency. And to the person experiencing it, the discomfort is so severe that they'll rewrite reality before they rewrite themselves. Cognitive dissonance doesn't scream, it whispers, it distorts, it justifies, and in its grip, you'll make peace with contradiction, not because it makes sense, but because it hurts less than admitting the truth. And that quiet pain, left unresolved, becomes the background noise of a life lived in denial. Framing effect. The framing effect is the manipulation of perception in plain sight, the unsettling truth that your decisions, beliefs, even emotions can be completely altered depending not on what you're told, but how you're told it. Two statements can describe the exact same reality, yet one makes you feel safe and the other fills you with dread. One makes you say yes, the other no. The facts haven't changed, only the frame. Tell someone a medical procedure has a 90% survival rate and they feel reassured. Tell them it has a 10% chance of death and panic sets in. Same odds, Same truth, opposite reaction. Your mind isn't calculating, it's feeling. And it's those feelings, not the facts, that steer your choices. This bias is everywhere. Politics, advertising, media, relationships. A politician says they'll cut taxes while their opponent slashes public services. A product is 95% fat-free, not 5% fat. A company eliminates inefficiency instead of laying off workers. The language isn't just strategic, it's psychological warfare because words carry emotion, and emotion is what your brain grabs first, long before logic even wakes up. The framing effect is why two people can hear the same message and walk away with opposite conclusions. One hears opportunity, the other hears threat, because it's not just the message that matters, it's the lens you're given to look through. And once that lens is in place, everything you see becomes tinted by it. This bias doesn't just change how you react, it changes how you remember. If something is framed as a gain, it feels like a success. Frame it as a missed opportunity, and it feels like failure, even if nothing was lost. The way a situation is presented becomes the way it lives in your mind. And the most unsettling part, you rarely notice it happening. The frame slips in silently, guiding your thoughts like invisible rails. You think you're making rational decisions, but you're responding to the version of reality someone chose for you because they knew what you didn't, that your mind doesn't follow facts, it follows feelings, and feelings are easily framed. Loss aversion. Loss aversion is the emotional imbalance at the core of human decision-making, the psychological truth that losing hurts more than winning feels good, twice as much in fact. A $100 gain might bring a smile, but a $100 loss, that stays with you. It lingers, it stings, because your brain doesn't treat losses and gains as equals. It treats loss as danger, something primal, something personal, something to avoid at all costs. This bias is rooted in survival. For early humans, a loss of food, shelter, safety could mean death. Evolution wired us to cling tightly to what we have, to fear risk more than we desire reward. And though modern life has changed, that ancient programming hasn't. We still react to loss with disproportionate intensity, whether it's money, reputation, time, or love. It's why investors hold on to failing stocks, terrified to lock in a loss, even as their portfolio sinks. It's why people stay in bad relationships, unable to walk away from what they've already put in. It's why gamblers chase losses, not out of greed, but desperation to get back to zero. And it's why you might decline an amazing opportunity, simply because the small risk of losing what you already have feels worse than the potential joy of gaining something better. Loss aversion makes you play life on defense. It whispers that it's better to stay still than take a chance. It convinces you that missing out is safer than messing up, that holding on, no matter how heavy, is better than letting go and risking regret. Even when the logic is clear, the fear of loss twists the scales until the rational choice feels wrong. And the worst part, it doesn't just limit you, it traps you, because the more you've invested, time, energy, money, emotion, the harder it becomes to walk away. You're not just afraid of losing the thing, you're afraid that if you lose it, everything you gave to get it was meaningless, that your effort, your sacrifice, your story was for nothing. Loss aversion isn't just fear of pain, it's fear that the pain will define you, and until you confront that fear, you'll keep gripping what's familiar, no matter how much it costs to hold on. Endowment Effect. The endowment effect is the mind's stubborn attachment to possession, the irrational tendency to overvalue what you already own simply because it's yours. It doesn't matter if it's objectively mediocre, easily replaceable, or something you didn't care about before. The moment it becomes yours, it becomes worth more. Not in reality, but in your perception. This bias sneaks in quietly. You're handed a free mug at a seminar, and minutes later, you wouldn't sell it for less than double what someone else would pay to buy it. It's not the mug, it's the ownership, a shift so subtle you don't feel it happen, but your brain does, because once you've touched it, named it, moved it into your space, it takes on a weight, a meaning, a value that didn't exist before. The endowment effect distorts your choices. It makes you cling to things you don't need, defend positions you no longer believe in, and hold on to relationships or routines that stopped serving you long ago. Why? Because they're familiar, because you've invested in them, because giving them up feels like loss, even if keeping them is slowly eroding you. It's why people overprice their homes when selling, why they hold on to stocks long after the smart move would be to cut losses, why hoarders see treasure where others see trash. It's not greed, it's identity. Once something is mine, letting go feels like letting go of a part of me. Marketers exploit this relentlessly. Free trials, personalized products, yours to try. Once you've interacted with the item, imagined it in your life, pictured it as part of your world, the hook is in. You don't want to lose it, even if you never wanted it to begin with. And the cruelest part? This bias doesn't make you happier. It makes you stuck. It turns life into a museum of your own past decisions, objects, ideas, and emotions gathering dust, protected not by logic, but by a flawed sense of value. Because deep down, the endowment effect isn't just about what you own, it's about what owns you. Negativity bias. Negativity bias is the shadow behind every thought, the deep psychological reflex that gives more power, more attention, and more emotional weight to the bad than the good. One insult cuts deeper than 5 compliments can heal. One failure echoes longer than a string of successes. One moment of fear, shame, or pain leaves a scar where joy leaves only a trace. This is not weakness. This is wiring. Your brain evolved to survive, not to be happy, and survival meant remembering danger loudly. A sweet berry might nourish you, but a bitter one could kill you. A kind stranger is nice, but a hostile one? That's a threat you better not forget. The mind, shaped by centuries of peril, learned to fixate on what could hurt, to replay it, obsess over it, avoid it at all costs. And so even now, when life is safer and the stakes are smaller, the wiring remains. A bad review eclipses dozens of glowing ones. A single rejection can make you question your worth. A harsh word from someone you love becomes a loop in your head, replayed for hours, days, years. Even your memories are filtered through this lens. Trauma stays sharp while joy fades like a dream. This bias poisons relationships. You fixate on flaws, on what they didn't do, on that one thing they said. You forget the quiet kindnesses, the everyday love, the moments they showed up. In parenting, in friendship, in love, negativity bias makes you hard to please and easy to wound. It poisons your relationship with yourself. You recall every misstep, every cringe-worthy moment, every perceived failure, replaying them as proof that you are not enough. You dismiss your wins, downplay your progress, and let one bad day rewrite the story of who you are. Negativity bias keeps you alert, but it also keeps you afraid, guarded, defensive. It convinces you that hurt is more real than healing, that risk is more dangerous than reward, and that trusting again is foolish. And if you don't catch it, don't question it, don't fight against its gravity, it will pull your entire life toward caution, resentment, and regret. Because in a mind ruled by negativity, even the light feels temporary, and the dark feels like truth. Status quo bias. The status quo bias is the quiet fear beneath comfort, the unconscious pull to keep things as they are, even when change is clearly better. It's the irrational preference for the familiar, the known, the routine, not because it's right, but because it feels safe. You stay in a job that drains you, a relationship that stifles you, a mindset that limits you, not because you're happy, but because you're afraid of what comes next. This bias whispers, "Better the devil you know." It convinces you that movement is risk, that change is danger, that doing nothing is wisdom, even when the data says otherwise. Even when your heart is begging for something different, you tell yourself now isn't the right time, that the timing will improve, that things might magically fix themselves if you just wait and wait and wait. The status quo bias is a psychological anchor. It tells you the current path is the default, and deviating from it demands justification, even when that default is leading you nowhere. You'll overestimate the costs of change, magnify the uncertainties, and downplay the suffering of staying. Not because change is harder, but because change is unknown. It affects everything: finances, health, career, love, politics. People vote for familiar candidates, even when they've failed them. They cling to outdated systems, broken routines, and dying traditions, not because they work, but because they're the way it's always been. The familiar becomes sacred, even when it's harmful. And it's not laziness, it's fear in disguise, fear of regret, fear of choosing wrong, fear of the guilt that might follow a bold decision. So you rationalize your inaction with comfort phrases. It's not that bad. At least I know what to expect. Others have it worse. But deep down, something aches, because your potential is quietly rotting beneath your loyalty to the way things are. The status quo bias doesn't just resist change, it steals momentum. It kills growth in slow, invisible ways. And perhaps the most tragic part, you might not even notice how much of your life you've spent defending a version of reality you stopped loving years ago, simply because it was yours. Social comparison bias. Social comparison bias is the bitter sting that rises when someone else shines brighter. It's the quiet resentment you feel toward those who outperform you, even when they've done nothing wrong. It's not just envy, it's something deeper, a threat to your identity, a bruise to your ego, a subtle, sharp whisper, "They're better than you." This bias thrives in moments of insecurity. When someone close to you wins, gets the promotion, the recognition, the applause, you don't always feel proud. You feel less. You start measuring, ranking, justifying. They got lucky. They're arrogant. They cheated. Your brain scrambles for reasons to dull the sting, because their success feels like your failure. Their rise feels like your fall. Even if you weren't competing, you start to act like you were, because in a world that constantly ranks people by beauty, wealth, influence, intelligence, you're trained to believe there's only so much best to go around, that someone else's glow dims your own, that if they're winning, you must be losing. This bias poisons relationships. It turns admiration into bitterness. It creates distance between friends, tension between teammates, rivalry between peers. You root for people until they get ahead of you. And then, quietly, painfully, you start to hope they trip. You smile, but it's tight. You congratulate them, but it burns. It also kills opportunity. You reject good ideas from people you feel threatened by. You avoid working with those who challenge you. You resist growth if it means someone else might take the spotlight. Because social comparison bias isn't just about wanting to win, it's about not wanting others to win more than you. And perhaps the most haunting part, the people you're resenting, those outperforming you, they're not thinking about outshining you at all. They're just moving forward, while you, chained by comparison, stay stuck, angry, distracted, unfulfilled. Social comparison bias doesn't just rob you of joy, it robs you of connection, of learning from those ahead of you, of celebrating others without shrinking yourself. And unless you confront it, you'll spend your life measuring worth in other people's mirrors, forever chasing a reflection that isn't even yours. Zero risk bias. Zero risk bias is the mind's desperate craving for absolute safety, the irrational preference to eliminate one small risk entirely rather than make a larger, more meaningful reduction in overall danger. It's the seductive illusion that no risk is somehow better than less risk, even when the math, the logic, and the stakes say otherwise. Because when faced with uncertainty, your brain doesn't seek balance, it seeks certainty, and zero feels like peace. This bias emerges from fear, not reason. It's why people will pay more to remove a 5% risk completely than to reduce a 50% risk down to 10%. It's why we obsess over safety features that address unlikely dangers while ignoring far more lethal threats that can't be fully erased. It's why we might overhaul an entire system to fix a minor vulnerability while tolerating major flaws in the name of familiarity. In health, we cling to miracle cures for one symptom, even if they ignore the bigger disease. In relationships, we cut off people to eliminate conflict entirely rather than learning to manage tension like adults. In business, we'll spend more to eliminate a tiny inefficiency than we will to reduce a larger risk that simply can't be wiped out completely. Absolute feels comforting, improvement feels uncertain. Zero risk bias hijacks our priorities. It warps decision-making in high-stakes environments, public policy, medicine, military, finance, by making us value illusion over impact. We fall for it because our minds are wired to hate risk more than we love gain. We want security, finality, control, and zero feels like all of those things wrapped into one seductive lie. But the danger is this: in chasing total safety in one place, we often ignore where the real threat lives. We overcorrect, we overspend, we make decisions that look smart but leave us more vulnerable than before, all because the number zero sings a siren song of false protection. And so, we fall for it, again and again, trading progress for comfort, trading smarter risk for no risk, not because it helps us live longer, but because for one moment it makes the chaos feel quiet, even if everything else is still burning. Belief bias. Belief bias is the mind's most seductive betrayal, the reflex to accept arguments not because they're logical, but because they feel true. It's the quiet override switch in your brain that whispers, "Does this match what I already believe?" And if the answer is yes, you'll let it pass, no matter how flawed the reasoning. But if it challenges your worldview, even perfect logic gets rejected, shoved aside, twisted into something you can safely ignore. This bias doesn't care about truth. It cares about comfort. You hear a conclusion you agree with, and your brain instantly lowers its guard. You don't scrutinize it. You don't test its logic. You welcome it because it fits. It confirms. It feels familiar. And in that moment, the structure of the argument becomes irrelevant. It's the conclusion that gets your loyalty. Belief bias shows up in politics, religion, science, morality, any area where identity and emotion are entangled with thought. A person hears a poorly reasoned argument that aligns with their values and they call it common sense. But when presented with a rock-solid logical case that contradicts what they believe, they nitpick, deflect, dismiss, not because the argument is wrong, but because it feels dangerous. This is how intelligent people fall for bad ideas, how critical thinking gets short-circuited. You think you're being rational, but you're really just protecting your beliefs. You bend logic to fit your conclusions instead of letting logic shape them, and you don't even realize you're doing it because belief bias doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as confidence. It divides people into echo chambers where truth becomes tribal, where logic is only accepted if it already agrees with the group's narrative. It makes disagreement feel like an attack and reasoned debate feel like betrayal. It turns learning into war, and it ensures that no matter how much evidence someone brings to the table, it won't matter. If it doesn't align with the belief, it won't survive. The cruel irony: the smarter you are, the better you become at rationalizing bad logic in service of belief. You don't escape belief bias by being intelligent. You escape it by being willing. willing to question what you think you know, and that is a far rarer strength. Authority bias. Authority bias is the quiet surrender of your own voice, the reflex to trust, obey, or agree with someone simply because they hold power, not because their ideas are better, not because they've earned it, but because they appear important. They wear a title, speak with confidence, stand on a stage, and just like that, your judgment bows before their authority. It begins early. As children, we're taught that those in charge know best. Parents, teachers, officials, they set the rules. Questioning them feels wrong, dangerous. So we grow up internalizing a hierarchy of credibility. The higher someone stands, the more right they must be. And this bias doesn't fade with age, it deepens. Now the suit, the stethoscope, the badge, the verified checkmark, each becomes a symbol that silences doubt. You assume they know more than you, that their confidence is competence, that disagreement would be foolish. But the danger is this: authority bias doesn't evaluate truth, it defaults to it. You'll believe the doctor's opinion, even if the science says otherwise. You'll follow a CEO's vision, even if it's reckless. You'll defend a leader's lie, not because it makes sense, but because they said it with conviction. Your own instincts, questions, and objections become background noise. You second-guess yourself. You defer. This bias fuels compliance in the face of corruption. It enables abusive leaders. It turns experts into gods and institutions into infallible machines. It's why war crimes get carried out under orders, why cult members follow commands that destroy them, why people silence their own morality just because someone above them made the call. And the worst part, it feels responsible. You tell yourself you're just following guidance, that you're trusting the process, that it's not your place to challenge the system, but deep down, you've handed over your judgment, and now you're co-signing whatever comes next. Authority bias doesn't just erode independence, it erodes accountability. It teaches you to outsource truth, and once that habit is in place, it doesn't matter who is in power. If they speak loudly enough, wear the right badge, or hold the right title, they'll never need to be right. They'll only need to be believed. Fear of missing out, FOMO. Fear of missing out, FOMO, is the slow, gnawing ache that everyone else is living while you're just watching. It's the deep, irrational anxiety that somewhere, right now, people are laughing without you, connecting without you, succeeding without you, and that you are falling behind, forgotten, left out, invisible. This bias feeds on comparison. You scroll through photos of vacations you can't afford, parties you weren't invited to, milestones you haven't reached. Each image isn't just a snapshot, it's a judgment, a reminder that they are experiencing life and you are not. And the worst part, you believe it, because your brain, under the influence of FOMO, fills in the blanks with fantasy. Their lives look perfect, effortless, joyful, while your own reality, mundane, quiet, raw, feels small in comparison. FOMO doesn't need to be triggered by something real. It only needs to feel real. One post, one story, one overheard conversation is enough to spark a spiral. You start questioning your choices. Should I have gone out, chosen a different career, moved to another city? You doubt your path, not because it's wrong, but because it's yours. And right now, someone else's path looks shinier. Marketers prey on this bias ruthlessly. Flash sales, limited spots, one-time only offers, each message crafted to whisper, if you don't act now, you'll miss something special. And so, FOMO pushes you to say yes when you mean no, to overcommit, to spread yourself thin in a desperate effort to be everywhere, to be part of everything. But the deepest wound FOMO leaves isn't exhaustion, it's emptiness. Because even when you join the party, book the trip, buy the thing, the feeling doesn't go away, it just morphs. Now you're worried there's something else, somewhere better, someone happier, something more fulfilling, and so the hunger stays, insatiable, FOMO steals presence. It turns moments into comparisons, joy into performance. It convinces you that happiness is always somewhere else and that you are forever one step behind. And unless you stop chasing the illusion, you'll spend your life in motion, surrounded by people, opportunities, and noise, yet still haunted by the aching suspicion that real life is happening just out of reach. Scarcity bias. Scarcity bias is the psychological spell that makes something more valuable, not because it's better, but because it's rare, limited edition, almost gone, one left in stock. The second you believe something might disappear, your desire for it spikes, urgently, irrationally, as if missing out would cost you more than just the thing itself, as if it would hurt your identity. This bias isn't about logic, it's about survival. In the primal mind, scarcity equals danger. If something is hard to get, it must be important. Food, water, shelter, scarce resources were once a matter of life and death. That wiring still lives inside us, but now it's applied to handbags, social attention, job offers, relationships. The rarer something seems, the more it feels like a threat to not have it. Scarcity bias is why only 3 seats left makes you click buy without thinking, why we chase unavailable partners, convinced their aloofness makes them more desirable, why luxury brands destroy unsold items to preserve the illusion of exclusivity. It's not about quality, it's about perception. If everyone can have it, it loses its shine. If you might not get it, suddenly you need it. This bias is ruthlessly exploited. Marketers know how to dangle the illusion of scarcity to hijack your decision-making. Flash sales, countdown timers, FOMO campaigns. They create pressure, not value. And under that pressure, people buy, sign, say yes. Not because they truly want something, but because they're afraid of losing the chance to have it. But scarcity bias isn't limited to material things. It warps how we value time, love, attention. You might obsess over someone who withdraws just because their affection feels rationed. You might neglect what's abundant in your life, chasing after what's withheld. And without realizing it, you start assigning worth based not on meaning, but on access. The most painful part? Once you have the thing you chased, its magic often fades. It wasn't the object you were obsessed with. It was the feeling of urgency, the thrill of the chase, the illusion of importance created by the threat of loss. Scarcity didn't make it valuable. You did, because your mind fears missing out more than it fears settling for something you never really needed in the first place. Triviality, bike shedding bias. Triviality bias, also known as bike shedding, is the mind's quiet escape hatch. It's the tendency to obsess over the small, simple, and irrelevant, while the big, complex, urgent problems sit untouched in the corner. It's a defense mechanism disguised as productivity, a comfortable distraction in the face of overwhelming responsibility. The name comes from a telling example. A committee tasked with approving the design of a nuclear power plant spends 5 minutes discussing the core reactor, then 45 minutes debating the color of the staff bike shed. Why? Because no one wants to look stupid. Nuclear physics is complicated. But bike sheds? Everyone has an opinion on that. So they linger there. They argue, they fine-tune, they feel involved, but they're not solving the real problem. They're avoiding it. Triviality bias shows up everywhere. In boardrooms where executives waste hours tweaking fonts on a slide deck while ignoring financial collapse. In families where people fight over dinner choices while avoiding the pain of a broken relationship. In personal life where you spend time organizing your desktop or picking the perfect playlist instead of facing the hard conversation, the overdue decision, the looming change. It gives you the illusion of control. It feels like progress, but it's not. It's avoidance dressed in productivity's clothing. We gravitate toward the trivial because the important often feels impossible. Complex problems require courage, expertise, uncertainty, and emotional discomfort. But trivial problems, they're safe, manageable, familiar, and they give us the one thing we crave more than clarity: certainty. You can't fix the economy, but you can argue about the company logo. You can't heal a broken marriage in one day, but you can clean the garage, so you do. And you tell yourself you're getting things done, but the cost is steep. Triviality bias wastes time, drains energy, and creates a false sense of accomplishment that delays real change. It convinces you that you're too busy to face what matters, when in reality, you're just hiding. And if you're not careful, you'll spend your life polishing bike sheds while the reactor melts down behind you.